First light in the distillery. You step into the distillery room while the rest of the farmhouse still sleeps under a blanket of deep autumn dark. The door swings on its iron hinges with a low sound that does not echo, because the stone walls are too thick and too old to return any noise. Outside the window, there is no color yet, only the faint suggestion that the line of hills beyond the river exists somewhere in the neutral gray that is not quite night and not quite morning. A small tallow candle burns on the wooden shelf by the door where you left it the evening before, its flame steady and yellow, and drawing a circle of soft light no wider than your outstretched arms, and inside that circle the shapes of the distillery emerge one by one as your eyes grow accustomed to the dimness. The air touches your face with the cool weight of a room that has rested for many hours without a fire, its temperature only a little warmer than the October mist gathering in the vineyard rows beyond the walls. You can smell yesterday's work still hanging in the stillness, the dry mineral scent of cold ashes from the firebox, the faint sweetness of grape skins that have long since given up their juice and now lie pressed and discarded, the deep brown perfume of old oak from the barrels stacked against the far wall, and underneath everything the clean sharp note of copper that never quite leaves a distillery, no matter how often you wipe down the metal. These smells do not rush at you, but simply wait, patient and familiar, until you breathe them in one at a time as you stand motionless just inside the doorway, letting your body adjust to the hour and the temperature and the task ahead. The alembic dominates the center of the room even in near darkness, its silhouette rising from the brick furnace like a dome built by some quieter, more useful civilization. You have looked at this copper shape every autumn for more years than you bother to count, and yet the first sight of it each morning still makes you pause, because the alembic in the half-light seems to be holding its breath, waiting for you to begin. The onion-shaped head curves upward, and then narrows into the swan's neck that bends toward the cooling coil, and the whole apparatus rests on its brick base, with the patience of something that knows it will outlast you and your children, and the stones of the farmhouse itself. The copper is dull now, darkened by the previous day's heat to a color somewhere between old penny and autumn leaf, but you know that once the fire catches and the warmth spreads, the metal will brighten, as though waking up. You move across the floor slowly, because there is no reason to hurry, your leather-soled shoes making only the softest whisper against the flagstones worn smooth by generations of distillers who rose before dawn just as you are rising now. The firebox door waits at knee height, a small arched opening of black iron with a simple latch that fits your thumb exactly as it fits your father's thumb and his father's before him, and when you lift the latch and swing the door open, the smell of cold ash rises to meet you like the memory of yesterday's warmth. Inside the firebox, the remains of the evening fire sit exactly as you left them, a mound of fine grey powder that was once oak branches and vine prunings, now reduced to something as soft as flour and as pale as the mist outside. You reach for the small hand broom that hangs from a nail beside the furnace, its bristles worn unevenly from seasons of use but still stiff enough to do their work, and you begin to sweep the ashes toward the front of the firebox with the same unhurried motion you have used 10,000 times. The ash slides across the fire-brick floor in a whisper that sounds like wind through dry leaves, piling up in a soft grey drift that you will collect and spread on the vegetable garden later, because nothing is wasted in a farmhouse distillery. Underneath the ash, the firebricks are still faintly warm from yesterday's long burn, and you rest your palm flat against them for a moment, feeling the leftover heat seep into your skin through the calluses that come from handling barrels and copper and firewood. And this small warmth is the first comfort of the morning. You scoop the ashes into a small iron bucket, using a flat piece of wood worn smooth as silk on one side, taking care not to raise dust because there is no wind in this room to carry it away, and you would rather it settle than float. The bucket fills with a soft sound like pouring sand, and when the firebox is empty, you set the bucket aside near the door where you will remember to carry it out later, and then you look into the clean, dark space where the new fire will soon live. The firebricks glow a faint terracotta in the candlelight, their surfaces marked with fine cracks from countless heating and cooling cycles that never quite break them, but only draw lines across their faces like the lines on an old man's hands. Now you turn to the kindling pile beside the hearth, a neat stack of twigs and split vine branches that you prepared weeks ago when the harvest was still underway and the days were busy with the sound of pickers in the fields and you select the first pieces with the same care you might use when choosing fruit from a market stall. The smallest twigs are no thicker than your little finger, cut from the prunings of last winter and dried all summer in the loft above the barn, where the heat of the sun through the roof tiles turned them brittle and ready, and you lay a handful of them across the firebox floor in a loose cross pattern that leaves plenty of room for air to move underneath. The wood is so dry that the ends have split into tiny cracks that look like stars, and when you handle them, they make a faint clicking sound like insects in a summer field. Above the first layer of thin twigs, you place slightly thicker branches cut from old grapevines that stopped producing fruit years ago and were pulled from the earth to make room for younger plants, their wood twisted into shapes that no other tree would recognize because grapevines grow in spirals and knots as though they cannot decide which direction to follow. And these contorted pieces fit together in the firebox in a way that leaves channels and gaps where the flame will later find its path. The vine wood carries a faint scent, even after years of drying, something earthy and slightly peppery that you notice only when you bring it close to your face, and this scent will join the other smells of the distillery once the fire catches and the morning truly begins. You arrange a few larger splits of oak at the very top of the pile, pieces left over from the cooper who comes every spring to repair the barrels and who always leaves his offcuts in a neat pile by the workshop door as a quiet gift to the distiller. And these oak chunks will burn long and steady once the kindling has done its work, providing the sustained heat that the alembic needs rather than the quick flare of the vine twigs. The wood feels solid and heavy in your hand, its grain running in straight parallel lines that promise an even burn without popping or sparking, and you set each piece down with both hands as though placing a book on the lectern. From the shelf above the firebox, you take the small clay pot that holds the charcloth. Squares of old linen burned in a closed crucible until they turned black and fragile, and now catch the smallest spark with an eagerness that still surprises you no matter how many times you witness it. And you tear off a corner no larger than your thumbnail and tuck it into the nest of kindling where the first flame will need to land. The charcloth leaves a fine black dust on your fingertips that you wipe absently on your apron as you reach for the flint and steel that rest in their own small wooden box, lined with felt worn thin from years of the same gesture. The steel is curved to fit your knuckles, and the flint is a piece of dark grey stone with one edge sharp enough to shave a hair, and you hold them in your hands without striking yet, because there is one more thing to do before the fire begins. You walk to the window, the one small window that looks east across the vineyard toward the river, and you push open the wooden shutter that has been closed all night against the damp. The hinges move without sound because you oiled them with a drop of olive oil at the start of the season, and the shutter swings outward into the grey air that rushes gently into the room like a tide reaching its highest point and pausing before it turns. And with this fresh air comes the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves and the particular emptiness of a landscape that has given up its harvest and now rests under a blanket of quiet mist. You could just make out the rows of vines retreating down the gentle slope toward the river, their bare branches like thin black lines drawn on grey paper, and beyond them the darker line of poplar trees that marks the water's path, and beyond that nothing but the soft edge where the mist meets the low clouds and the world stops being visible. The cold air moves through the room in a slow current that you cannot feel on your skin but can sense by the way the candle flame bends slightly toward the door, and this movement will help draw the fire when you light it, giving the first small flames the breath they need to grow. You stand at the window for a small space of time that cannot be measured in minutes because there is no clock in the distillery and no need for one, and you watch the grey light grow almost imperceptibly brighter until the shapes of the nearest vines become distinct enough that you could count them if you wished, and then you close the shutter most of the way, leaving only a gap as wide as your hand so that the air will continue its gentle passage through the room without bringing in too much cold. You return to the stool by the firebox, a simple three-legged seat made from the same oak as the barrels and polished by decades of seated waiting, and you sit down facing the open door with the flint and steel in your lap and the kindling waiting in its careful arrangement. The candle on the shelf has burned down perhaps the width of a finger during these small preparations, and you note this without concern because the new fire will soon provide all the light you need. You lift the steel in your left hand and the flint in your right, positioning them just above the charcloth, and then you strike once with a quick downward motion that produces a brief shower of orange sparks that scatter across the black linen and immediately die. And you strike again with the same motion, and this time one spark catches and holds and begins to eat outward in a tiny circle of orange that pulses like a heartbeat. You lower the charcoal into the nest of twigs and blow gently across it, a long, slow breath that feeds the flame without overwhelming it, and the fire begins. The small flame you coaxed from the charcloth now sits at the heart of the twig nest, like a visitor who has just arrived and is still deciding whether to stay. It is no larger than a candle flame, a tongue of orange and pale yellow that wavers with every breath you release, and you continue to blow across it in the same long, gentle manner, not pushing too hard, lest you snuff it out, but not stopping too soon, lest it falter. The flame leans in the direction of your breath, and then straightens, and as it straightens, it reaches upward and sideways to taste the nearest twigs, the ones so dry that their ends have cracked open, and it finds them good. The first twig catches with a faint tick like a green log giving up its sap, but it is not green and there is no sap, only the sound of old dry wood accepting fire, and the flame changes color where it touches the new fuel, turning from pale yellow to a brighter, more confident orange that announces it has found something to eat. You watch this transition without moving, your face close enough to the firebox that you feel the thin line of heat forming around your cheeks and forehead, and your hands rest on your knees while the flame does what flames always do when given the right conditions, which is to spread, to multiply, to transform what was solid into light and warmth and the invisible gases that will soon travel through the copper dome and begin the long work of distillation. You reach for another thin twig, this one curved like a shepherd's crook because it grew from the elbow of a grapevine that once turned a sharp corner around a trellis wire, and you offer it to the fire not by dropping it, but by laying it carefully across the already burning pieces with the same deliberate attention you would use when placing a delicate tool on a shelf. The twig settles into the flames, and for a brief moment it lies there unchanged, its bark dark and textured like old leather, and then a small blue flame appears at its tip and runs along the underside, and within 3 breaths the whole twig is alight and adding its voice to the chorus of small crackles that fill the firebox. The sound of a young fire is not loud, it is a conversation held in whispers and clicks, and the occasional soft pop when a trapped pocket of air expands and escapes, breaking a tiny chamber of wood open with a sound like a footstep on gravel, but much smaller and more polite. You listen to this conversation while your eyes adjust to the growing light that pushes back the candle's yellow circle and begins to reveal details in the room that were hidden before. The grain of the oak beam above your head, the small copper ladle hanging from its hook, the spider web in the corner that catches the new light and turns it into a pattern of silver threads. No spider ever intended, but which is beautiful all the same. The fire talks to itself and you listen, and you add another twig when the conversation seems to be slowing down. The smoke rises now, a thin grey stream that curls upward from the kindling and passes through the open firebox door before finding the wider mouth of the chimney, flue built into the stonework, and you watch it ascend with the same fascination that humans have always brought to watching smoke. Because smoke never moves the same way twice, and yet always obeys the same laws of hot air seeking cold. It twists and spirals and flattens against the underside of the chimney throat, spreading briefly like water poured onto a flat stone before it finds the upward passage and disappears into the dark shaft that leads to the roof and then to the grey October sky outside. You imagine, without getting up to check, that anyone standing in the vineyard would see a thin line of pale smoke rising straight from the farmhouse chimney. A signal that work has begun inside, the only movement in a landscape that is otherwise completely still. The warmth reaches your hands now, spreading outward from the firebox in slow waves that pulse with each new flame that catches, and you hold your palms open toward the opening, rotating them gently as though you were warming them over a winter hearth, though it is not winter, and the room is not truly cold, only cool enough that the warmth is welcome, rather than necessary. The heat seeps into your knuckles and travels up the small bones of your fingers, loosening the stiffness that the night left behind, and you flex your hands once, twice, feeling the blood move more freely, before returning them to your lap to wait for the next moment in the fire's development. The warmth also carries with it the first hint of what the vine wood leaves behind as it burns. a faint peppery aroma that is not smoke exactly, but something else, something that reminds you of autumn itself, of fallen leaves and turned earth, and the long, slow decay that feeds the soil for next year's growth. You select a larger branch now, one of the split oak pieces that the cooper left behind, its flat face showing the medullary rays that run across the grain like flecks of silver paint. And you hold it in both hands for a moment, considering its weight and the way the rough surface catches on the fabric of your apron before you lay it gently on top of the burning twigs. The oak does not catch immediately because it is denser and contains less air, so it sits on the flames like a bridge over a stream, darkening slowly where the heat touches it, and then a thin line of smoke begins to rise from its surface at the exact point where a grain line ends. And this smoke is different from the vine smoke because it carries a sweetness that will later be part of the spirit's flavor, even though you will not understand that connection for many hours. The oak branch shifts slightly as the twigs beneath it burn away and collapse, settling into the fire with a small sigh that is more felt than heard, and the flames wrap around its edges and begin their slow work of turning hardwood into heat. You add another oak piece beside the first, and then a third across them, forming a loose triangle that leaves gaps for the flame to climb through. And with each addition the fire grows in strength and confidence, until it no longer needs your breath to survive, drawing its own air from the room through the open door of the firebox in a steady draft that you can feel if you hold your hand just below the opening door of the firebox. In a steady draft that you can feel if you hold your hand just below the opening. The draft is cool on the back of your hand, while the heat presses against your palm, and this contrast, cool and warm, draft and flame, becomes a kind of balance that you maintain without thinking, like standing upright or breathing. The firebox now glows with a light that has changed from candle yellow to the deep orange red of a sunset seen through dust, and the bricks at the back of the chamber begin to radiate their own warmth back into the fire, storing the heat as they were designed to do, and releasing it slowly so that the temperature builds steadily rather than in spikes. You observe the color of the bricks change from dark terracotta to a brighter shade as the heat penetrates deeper into their substance, and you know from experience that it will take another hour before they are fully saturated with warmth and ready to pass that warmth upward into the copper pot that sits above them, the pot that contains the fermented wine, waiting patiently in the dark, unaware of the transformation that is coming. You reach for the small iron poker that hangs beside the broom on the wall, its handle wrapped in leather that has turned black and smooth with use, and you use its hooked tip to gently adjust the position of one of the oak pieces that has rolled slightly to the side, nudging it back into the center of the fire, where the heat is most concentrated. The poker glides through the flames without disturbing them, and you watch the oak piece settle into its new position with a small shower of sparks that rise and die before they reach the top of the firebox. Each spark a tiny orange star with a lifespan shorter than a single breath. You return the poker to its hook, and the hook receives it with a small clink that rings for a moment in the quiet room, and then the quiet returns, filled only by the fire's continuing whisper. The liquid in the copper pot, though you cannot see it, is beginning to feel the warmth now, the heat traveling upward through the iron plate that forms the floor of the pot and spreading into the fermented wine that has been waiting all night in the sealed darkness above. You imagine it stirring slightly, the lightest convection current forming as the molecules near the bottom warm and rise and are replaced by cooler molecules from above, a slow circulation that will continue for many hours before the first bubbles of vapor begin to form and the real work of distillation commences. But that is still far away. Right now there is only this patient transfer of heat, molecule by molecule, degree by degree, a process so gradual that if you could see it, you would not be able to detect any movement at all. You pour yourself a cup of water from the clay pitcher that sits on the shelf where you left it yesterday, the water cool and tasting faintly of the wellstone it came from, and you drink slowly while seated on your stool, watching the fire with the same steady attention a shepherd gives to a flock on a hillside. The fire needs nothing from you in this moment. It is burning well, the flames established, the draught steady, the chimney drawing properly. So you sit and let your mind settle into the rhythm of the morning, a rhythm that has no beats per minute, but instead moves at the pace of wood transforming into warmth, which is the slowest rhythm there is. Slower even than the growth of the vines outside. slower than the turning of the seasons, though it contains both those rhythms inside it. Like the slysnidit, the largest netnestidilkosek gladailst nolbriholt. Outside the window, the mist has not yet lifted, and the vineyard remains a study in grey and brown, the bare vines standing in their rows like sentences written in a language you can read but not translate, a language of patience and dormancy, and the quiet storage of energy in roots that reach deep into the chalky soil of the Charte. You think of the harvest that finished a fortnight ago, the sound of the pickers' baskets filling with pale green grapes, the carts rolling toward the press house, the sweet smell of fresh juice, all of it now past, and the workers gone home to their own villages, leaving you alone with the wine and the still and the slow fire, which is how you prefer it. The quiet of the harvest lull is a different quality of quiet than any other time of year, deeper and more complete, a quiet that settles over the land like a second blanket and muffles even the memory of noise. A branch shifts in the fire, settling with a soft crunch, and you glance back at the flames that have now taken full possession of the oak pieces, burning through them with a steady gold and blue dance that throws moving shadows onto the copper belly of the alembic above. The metal responds to the heat with a series of very small sounds, the creaks and pings of expansion that mark the beginning of the still's waking, and you find these sounds comforting because they mean that everything is working as it should, that the copper is warming evenly, that the seals you checked yesterday are holding, that the long chain of events that leads from grape to fire to vapor to spirit is continuing unbroken. You add one final piece of oak, smaller than the others, and irregularly shaped like a wedge split from a larger log, because you judge that the fire now has enough fuel to burn for a while without attention, and you want to give it the means to do so. This piece settles into the embers immediately, its dry grain catching fire across its entire surface within seconds, and a new plume of smoke, fragrant and white, joins the thin column that still rises into the chimney, a column that you can no longer see because the firebox is now so bright that looking into it makes the rest of the room seem darker by contrast. But you know the smoke is there, continuing its silent journey upward through the stone flue to emerge into the grey sky where it will you fold your hands in your lap and let your breathing slow to match the fire's pace, and you notice that somewhere between the first strike of the flint and this moment of settled burning, you have entered a state of mind that is neither wakeful nor sleeping, but something in between, a state in which time moves differently, and tasks unfold not as a series of separate actions but as one continuous movement, like a river that appears to be many waves but is really a single flow. The fire breathes, and you breathe, and the copper expands and the wine begins its slow warm-up, and the morning outside the window remains grey and still and full of mist, and you sit on your three-legged stool in the heart of the distillery while the alembic stands over you like a patient animal, waiting for the heat to do its work. The fire has settled into that phase of burning which distillers call the steady heart, where the flames no longer leap and search but sit firmly on the bed of embers, drawing air through the grate with a low, constant hum and releasing their heat in an even stream that rises around the curved bottom of the copper pot. You have been sitting on your stool long enough that the wood has accepted the shape of your body, and your body has accepted the shape of the stool. A mutual arrangement that makes you feel less like a person sitting and more like a component of the room, another piece of the apparatus waiting in the quiet. One of the first things you notice, now that the fire is established and you have no immediate task for your hands, is the way the air in the distillery begins to change its character. The cold draft from the cracked open window still slides across the floor, but above it a layer of warmer air is building that presses upward against the ceiling beams and spills outward from the firebox in gentle rolls that you can feel when you lift your chin. The warmth carries with it the smell of hot brick now, a clean baked clay scent that joins the oak sweetness and the vine pepper, and beneath all of these the sharper note of copper heating up, a metallic tang that is not unpleasant, but simply present, like the smell of rain on dry stone. You rise from the stool to check the copper pot, not because you need to yet, but because the habit of watching the still at this stage is so old that your legs move before your mind gives them permission. Stepping closer to the alembic, you see that the dull autumn leaf color of the copper has already begun to change near the base, a subtle brightening that spreads upward from the iron connection plate where the heat is most direct, turning the metal from dark penny to a warmer rose gold that catches the firelight and holds it. You reach your hand toward the pot's surface, not touching but hovering your palm an inch away, and the warmth that meets your skin is soft and diffuse, like holding your hand over a sleeping animal, feeling the life underneath without disturbing it. The copper answers the heat with sound before it answers with visible change. You hear the first small creak as you stand there, a noise like a branch bending slowly underwater, followed by a longer sigh that seems to travel around the curve of the pot and disappear into the dome above. These are the sounds of metal growing, expanding outward and upward by distances too small for your eye to measure, but large enough to release the tensions that were locked into the copper when it was hammered into shape years ago. The alembic is waking up, stretching itself after a night of cold, and you listen to its morning language with the same patience you would give to an old friend who speaks slowly and does not repeat himself. The fermented wine inside the pot, 600 liters of pale liquid made from the young New Blanc grapes you helped harvest in the first week of October, begins to feel the heat now. You cannot see it, of course. The pot is sealed with a flour and water paste along the joint where the dough meets the base, and the only openings are the small bunghole plugged with a wooden stopper and the swan's neck that leads to the coil. But you know the liquid is warming because the air around the dome has taken on a faint sweet acid smell that was not there before. The first volatile compounds roused from their sleep by the creeping temperature, and this smell mixes with the wood smoke and the hot brick and the copper tang to form the particular perfume of a distillery in its first hour of work. You return to the firebox, kneel down with a slight protest from your knees that you ignore because you have been ignoring it for years, and peer into the bed of embers. The oak pieces have now lost their individual shapes and merged into a glowing orange mass that pulses gently with the draught, brightening and dimming in a slow rhythm that matches the chimney's pull. You take the poker again and gently lift one edge of the ember bed, allowing a thin stream of air to pass underneath, and the glow brightens immediately, a flush of yellow-white that spreads across the coals like a wave and then fades as you lower the poker. This small adjustment, a tilt of the wrist and a breath of oxygen, is enough to maintain the temperature at the right level for now. Too cool, and the wine will never boil. Too hot, and the copper will stress, and the spirit will carry a scorched taste that no barrel can mend. You notice a single brick under the fire grate has settled at a slight angle during the night, perhaps from the contraction of the cooling fire, and this angle is directing more heat toward the left side of the pot than the right. You reach into the small space beneath the firebox, your knuckles brushing the warm flagstones, and nudge the brick with your thumb until it sits flat again. A correction of no more than a thumb's width, but one that will keep the heat even across the entire base of the still. The brick is rough and warm and fits into its bed with a small grinding sound, and you wipe your thumb on your apron without looking at it, your attention still on the fire. Now the copper dome above you begins to grow truly warm to the touch. You test it with the back of your hand, a quick press against the metal just above the joint line, and you feel a definite heat that is no longer the gentle warmth of a sleeping animal, but the purposeful temperature of a machine coming up to working speed. The heat has climbed from the base to the lower curve of the onion-shaped head, and as it climbs it carries with it the first molecules of alcohol vapor that are lighter than water and quicker to wake, rising from the surface of the wine like early birds from a marsh at dawn. These molecules are still too few to condense into anything visible. They exist only as a change in the smell, which has now shifted from sweet acid to something more floral, a hint of white flowers and cut grass that comes and goes with the draughts of air in the room. You step to the window, pull the shutter open a little wider to let out some of the warmth that has now built up enough to make your cheeks flush, and the cold October air rushes in along the floor, clearing the heavier scents and leaving behind the sharper, cleaner smell of the mist outside. In the brief moment while the air exchanges itself, you can see the vineyard again, unchanged from an hour ago, except that the grey light has brightened perhaps half a shade, enough to show the texture of the bare soil between the vine rows, a rough corduroy of ploughed earth dotted with the small dark shapes of fallen leaves. You close the shutter back to its hand-width gap and return to the stool, and the warmth that had briefly retreated now flows back around you like a tide returning. The copper continues its conversation of small sounds. You hear a ping now, sharper than the earlier creaks, and you know that it comes from the rivet near the swan's neck, where two pieces of copper overlap and have expanded at slightly different rates, and this ping announces that the neck is now warm enough that the vapors will not condense too early and drip back into the pot, but will instead travel all the way to the cooling coil. You do not need to check the thermometer, because there is no thermometer in this distillery. Only your hand and your ear and your nose and your long memory of how a still behaves when the fire is right and the weather is cool and damp and the wine is from a year that gave thin acid grapes because the summer was unremarkable and the harvest came early under cast skies. All of these things enter into your judgment, and your judgment tells you that everything is moving exactly at the speed it should move. You take down a small glass phial from the shelf, a tube no longer than your finger, with a thin neck and a round belly, and you hold it under your nose for a moment, even though it is empty, breathing in the ghost of past distillations that still clings to the glass, a faint echo of pear and honey and distant flowers. You will use this phial later to catch a sample of the first spirit that runs from the spout, but that is still some time away, and for now you simply hold it, rolling it between your fingers, feeling the cool, smooth glass warm slowly in your palm, while the room around you continues its deliberate transformation. The lees in the bottom of the pot, the fine silt of dead yeast cells and tiny grape solids that settled out of the wine during fermentation, are also feeling the heat now, and as the temperature rises past blood heat toward the range where water thinks about boiling, these solids begin to move in a slow convection that you cannot see but can sense through the change in the way the copper sounds. The creaks become less frequent, replaced by a very low hum that is more felt through the soles of your shoes on the flagstones than heard through your ears, a vibration that comes from the liquid stirring itself inside the pot, turning over and over in a cycle that brings the warm lees up from the bottom and sends the cooler wine down to meet the hot metal. This stirring is the stills version of breathing, and you synchronize your own breathing with it without meaning to. A slow inhale as the wine rises and a slow exhale as it falls, until the boundary between your body and the machine's body becomes porous. You have now been in the distillery for perhaps 2 hours, though you have not counted the time and would not care to, and the fire has burned down enough that you need to add more fuel. You select a piece of vine trunk thicker than your arm, a section from an old plant that died 2 winters ago and was pulled from the ground and cut into lengths for just such a purpose, and you place it on the embers with the care of someone setting a log on a funeral pyre. Not because anything is dying, but because the act seems to deserve a certain solemnity. The vine trunk catches after a slow count of 20, its old fibrous flesh burning with a different flame than the oak, more yellow and more smoky, releasing a scent of ancient soil and deep root systems that you breathe in with your eyes closed for a moment. While your eyes are closed, you listen to the whole room, the fire's low roar that is more like a loud whisper, the chimney's steady draw that sounds like a distant wind through a keyhole, the copper's occasional announcement of its expansion, the creak of the oak stool under your shifting weight, the soft patter of a small piece of soot falling somewhere in the chimney and landing on the stone ledge with a noise like a mouse's footstep, and beyond all of these, absolute silence of the vineyard outside. Its own wide, its own. You open your eyes and the room looks exactly as it did before, and yet something has changed, because you have changed. Sinking deeper into the rhythm of the morning, the warmth from the copper pot now radiates outward into the room, heating the air that circles around the dome and falls gently onto your shoulders, and you unbutton the top button of your woolen overshirt, because the combined heat of the fire and the still has made the room comfortable in a way that the early morning was not. The candle on the shelf has become unnecessary. The firelight provides all the illumination you need, throwing long shadows that move with the flames and paint the walls with patterns of light and dark that shift constantly but so slowly that you cannot catch them in the act of shifting, only in the result of having shifted. It is like watching the hour hand of a clock, which moves, but never when you look at it. You pour another cup of water from the pitcher, and the water is now not as cool as it was earlier, because the pitcher has been sitting in the warmed room, but it still tastes of the well and still cuts through the slight dryness in your throat that comes from breathing warm air and wood smoke. You drink it in small sips, letting each sip rest in your mouth before you swallow. And while you drink, your eyes remain on the copper dome, watching for the first sign of condensation on the swan's neck. That faint misting that will tell you the vapors have begun their journey in earnest. There is no mist yet, only the clean bright copper glowing with its own inner warmth. So you set down the cup and fold your hands again and wait. Waiting in a distillery is not the same as waiting elsewhere. Elsewhere, waiting is an interruption between actions, a pause you endure until the next thing happens. Here, waiting is the action itself, the primary task, the reason you are here. The fire burns, the heat rises, the wine warms, the copper expands, and all of these things happen at their own pace, which cannot be hurried and does not need to be watched constantly, but only attended to. Like a garden that grows while you sleep and while you wake, and demands only that you be present for the small adjustments that keep it on its course. You are an attendant, a tender, a watcher of the fire, and the waiting is your craft. The first change in the visible copper happens so gradually that you almost miss it, but your eye, trained by years of mornings just like this one, catches the faintest haze forming on the lower part of the swan's neck, just above the dome, a patch of dullness on the bright metal that spreads as you watch, slow as the advance of damp on a stone wall. This is the heat reaching the neck, and the dullness is the beginning of oxidation, the copper reacting with the warmer air to form a thin brown bloom that will darken over the course of the day until it matches the color of the older patina on the dome. You note its arrival without comment, filing it away as one more sign that the morning is proceeding correctly. You walk around the alembic to check the cooling worm, which sits inside a wooden barrel filled with water drawn from the well yesterday evening. The water is still cold. You dip a finger into it and feel the chill that comes from deep underground, a temperature that has not changed since the water fell as rain many years ago and percolated through the limestone until it gathered in the dark stillness of the aquifer. The coil of copper tubing that carries the spirit vapor is submerged in this cold water, and when the vapors finally reach the coil, they will meet this coldness and turn back into liquid, drop by drop, each drop a concentration of all the heat and patience you have invested in this morning. You swirl the water gently with your hand, checking that no leaves or dust have fallen in overnight, and the water moves around your fingers with the thick, heavy feel of cold liquid, offering no resistance and yet somehow heavy, as though the cold gives it extra weight. You return to the firebox, kneel once more, and use the poker to spread the embers in a thin, even layer across the grate, which is something you do every quarter hour or so to maintain the consistency of the heat. The embers blow brighter where you disturb them, a flash of orange-white that fades as they resettle, and the vine trunk you added is now well alight, its yellow flame steady and its smoke pale and sweet. You push the firebox door almost closed, leaving only a gap the width of your 2 fingers to control the draft, and this adjustment slows the burn slightly, stretching the fuel over a longer period, which is what the spirit needs at this stage, a low, steady heat that will bring the wine to the edge of boiling without pushing it over too fast, so that the alcohol can separate itself from the water in a gradual, orderly fashion, molecule by molecule, like guests leaving a feast one at a time, rather than all connect. The smell in the room has deepened further, the floral grass notes now joined by something warmer, almost bready, the smell of the yeast lees beginning to cook gently at the bottom of the pot without scorching because the fire is low and diffuse. It is a rich, nourishing smell that makes you think of baking, though there is no flour here and no bread, only the transformation of fruit and time and heat into something that will one day, years from now, be poured into a glass and held up to a candle and admired for its color and its clarity and its long memory of this very morning, in this very room, with this very fire. But that day is far away, and you are not thinking about it because the present moment is full enough. The quiet now so complete that when a bird flies past the window and calls once, a single liquid note, it drops into the silence like a pebble into a pond, and the ripples take a long time to fade. The morning has now fully arrived, though you would not call it bright, for the sun remains hidden behind a layer of cloud that stretches across the entire Sharpend Valley from the coast to the distant hills and turns the world into a study in greys. You can tell that the hour is perhaps mid-morning by the quality of the light falling through the window, a diffuse pearly glow that makes shadows soft at their edges rather than sharp, and by the way the mist has thinned just enough to let you see the poplar trees along the river as dark vertical strokes against a paler dark, like lines drawn with a charcoal stick on grey paper. Inside the distillery, the fire continues its steady work. The alembic hums its low song, and you find yourself drawn to the window, not by any need, but by the pull of the silence outside, which has become so deep and so complete that it feels like another presence in the room. You rise from the stool, your movements slow and deliberate because there is no call to hurry, and you cross the few steps to the window where the shutter still stands open. The width of your hand. The flagstones feel solid and cool through your shoes, each one familiar in its slight unevenness, the hollows worn by centuries of feet passing between the fire and the light. You place both hands on the wooden sill, a thick plank of chestnut darkened by age and smoothed by the rub of countless sleeves, and you lean slightly forward until your face is close to the gap, your breath misting briefly on the cold air that seeps in. The cold air meets the warmth of the room and a small eddy forms, swirling around your collar before dissipating, and you taste on it the clean mineral flavor of wet soil and fallen leaves, a taste that belongs to autumn itself. Outside the window, the vineyard stretches away in rows that follow the gentle fall of the land toward the river, a slope so gradual that walking it feels almost like walking on flat ground until you look back and see how far you have descended. The vines are bare now, the harvest finished a fortnight past, and their brown twisted arms reach upward from the grey trunks in shapes that seem frozen in a gesture of offering, as though they are still holding out their fruit to hands that are no longer there. Between the rows, the soil lies freshly turned, ploughed under after the last grapes were taken, and the rough texture of the earth catches the diffuse light in a way that makes it look like corduroy fabric stretched across the fields, its ridges and furrows running in straight parallels that converge somewhere near the river and disappear into the remaining mist. Nothing moves in the vineyard. Not a bird on the wires, not a rabbit in the furrows, not a single leaf dropping from the branches, because all the leaves have already fallen and lie now as a dark mulch at the foot of each vine, returning themselves to the soil in the slow, quiet chemistry of decay. You can see the line of poplars more clearly now, their tops emerging from the low mist as the air warms inch by inch, and they stand like sentinels along the riverbank with their branches held close to their trunks in the narrow upright habit that gives them their name in the local dialect, a word that sounds like the whisper of wind through their leaves, even when there is no wind. Beyond the poplars, the river itself remains invisible, only the knowledge of its presence confirmed by the darker band of vegetation that follows its course, and by the occasional glint of light that might be water catching the diffuse sun, or might be nothing more than a trick of the eye, a wish for water in a landscape that has turned dry and dormant. Further still, the hills rise in soft undulations, their shapes blurred by the mist into gentle humps that seem to be breathing slowly under a grey blanket, and on the nearest hill you can just make out the spire of the village church, a thin needle of darker grey against the sky, too far to show any detail but close enough to remind you that other people exist in the world, even though they have no place in this morning's silence. You push the shutter open a little wider, the wood moving smoothly on its oiled hinges, and the sound it makes is absorbed immediately by the thick air, as though the mist itself were a kind of felt laid over the world to muffle every noise. The wider opening lets in a rectangle of cold air that falls to the floor and spreads across the flagstones, and the candle on the shelf behind you gutters once before steadying, the flame bending away from the window and then straightening. With the shutter open, you can now see a wider swath of the farmyard immediately below, the packed earth swept clean of leaves by the wind that came through 3 days ago and has not returned since, leaving the ground as bare and tidy as a swept floor. The farm cart stands against the wall of the barn, its shafts resting on the ground and its wheels dusty from the last trip to the press house, and beside it a pile of empty baskets is stacked in a neat pyramid. The baskets that held the Ugni Blanc grapes during the harvest and now sit waiting for next year, their wicker sides stained faintly purple where the juice soaked in and dried. A single hen, the only living creature visible, picks her way across the yard with the precise head-bobbing gait of her kind, pausing every few steps to examine something on the ground that only she can see, and her feathers are fluffed against the cold, so that she looks like a small grey cushion moving on invisible legs. Beyond the farmyard, the lane runs straight for 100 paces before curving around the edge of the vineyard and disappearing between 2 rows of bare hazel bushes that mark the boundary between your land and the neighbour's fallow field, and the lane is empty. Its surface unrutted because no cart has passed since the harvest ended, and no cart will pass again until the winter pruning brings workers back to the vines. The emptiness of the lane has a quality to it that goes beyond simple absence. It is an active emptiness, a presence of nothing that feels deliberate and complete, as though the lane itself is resting after the busyness of September and October and has settled into a deep stillness that it will not relinquish until the seasons turn again. You let your gaze travel back across the vineyard rows, counting them without meaning to. A habit from childhood, when your father would stand at this same window and point out which sections needed more manure or which vines showed signs of the mildew that sometimes comes in wet summers, and you reach the number 23 before you stop, because the 24th row disappears into a bank of mist that still clings to the lower ground near the stream that feeds the river, a small stream that you cannot see but can locate by the line of the trace. The mist in the hollow looks thicker than the mist elsewhere, a dense white-grey that does not move or thin but simply sits, heavy and patient, waiting for the sun to reach it with sufficient strength to lift it away, and the sun is not yet strong enough and may not be strong enough all day. You turn your head slightly to look toward the east where the light is brightest, and you can see that the cloud cover is thinner there, not quite breaking, but thinning enough to show a pale disk of whiteness where the sun must be. A diffused glow that casts no shadows and gives no warmth, but still manages to suggest that somewhere above the grey the sky is blue and the sun is shining, which is a small comfort in a morning that has been nothing but tonalities of ash and pearl. A bird, the same bird that called earlier, or perhaps a different one, flies across the gap between the barn roof and the nearest poplar, its flight a straight line of purpose that cuts the grey air like a needle through cloth, and you watch it until it disappears into the branches and the stillness closes behind it as though it had never passed. The silence outside is not absolute, because no silence ever is, but it is close enough that the few sounds that do reach your ears seem to come from very far away or from very close by, with nothing in between. From far away you can hear, or perhaps imagine you hear, the faintest suggestion of the river moving over its stones, a sound so low and so continuous that it might be the blood moving in your own ears rather than anything external. But you have stood at this window in every season, and you know the river's voice, a deep, soft murmur that carries across the fields only when the air is still and the world is quiet. And this is one of those mornings when the river can be heard if you listen properly. From close by you hear the small sounds of the hen scratching at the packed earth of the yard, a faint rustle, and the occasional click of her beak against a pebble, and these sounds are so familiar that you barely notice them. They are simply part of the texture of the morning, like the grain of the wood under your hands, or the slow pulse of warmth from the fire behind you. You shift your weight from one foot to the other, and the floorboard beneath the window creaks once, a dry sound that is louder than anything else in the room except the fire's whisper, and the contrast between this small domestic noise and the vast quiet outside makes you aware of the boundary between inside and outside, as though it were a physical thing, a membrane that separates two different worlds, one of warmth and copper and crackling flame, the other of grey light and bare rides and slow-moving mist. You exist on this boundary, a watcher at the threshold, and that is exactly where a distiller should stand during the harvest lull, neither fully in the world of the living vineyard nor fully in the world of the cooking spirit, but suspended between them in a pause that has its own purpose and its own rhythm. You think about the weeks that have passed, the noise of the harvest that now seems like a dream you had long ago. There were pickers in the rows, their hands moving quickly among the leaves, their voices calling to one another in the old dialect that uses words you only hear during the grape season. Words for the different sizes of bunches, words for the state of ripeness, words for the state of ripeness, words for the particular angle of the morning sun on the east-facing slopes. The baskets filled and were emptied into the cart. The cart groaned under the weight and was led to the press. The press creaked and dripped and filled the air with a sweet, heavy smell of fresh juice and crushed skins, and the whole farmyard was busy from dawn to dusk with the organized labor of bringing in the fruit before the weather turned. Then one day the last row was picked, the last basket emptied, the last cartload taken to the press house, and the workers collected their pay and walked down the lane toward the village, their voices fading until they were indistinguishable from the rustle of the dry leaves under their feet. And then they were gone, and the silence came down like a shutter closing, and you were alone, with the wine and the still and the season of quiet work that stretches from the end of harvest to the beginning of winter pruning. This is the time you prefer, not because you dislike company, but because the work of distillation asks for a particular kind of attention that is incompatible with noise and hurry, an attention that spreads out like the mist and fills the hours without rushing them, an attention that notices the small changes in the copper's color and the slight shifts in the fire's sound and the exact moment when the smell of the vapor changes from grassy to floral. In the busy season, you work with your body in your hands and your voice calling instructions across the rows. In the lull, you work with your senses and your patience, and the two kinds of work are both necessary but completely different, like the two halves of a single breath. You draw a long, slow breath now, filling your lungs with the cool air from the window, and you hold it for a moment before releasing it, and the release is visible as a small cloud of condensation that drifts away from your face and dissolves. The cold air clears your head of the slight drowsiness that comes from sitting too long in the warm firelight, and you feel more awake now, more present, your senses sharpened by the contrast between the heated room behind you and the grey October chill in front of you. You look at the vineyard again, not searching for anything but simply receiving what is there. The rowels, the brown earth, the twisted vines, the low sky, the mist in the hollow, the poplars by the invisible river, the spire on the distant hill, all of it arranged in a composition that has not changed since yesterday, and will not change until the winter gales come and strip the last dead leaves from the hazel hedges and rearrange the clouds into the running Atlantic storms. A very light breeze stirs for a moment, the first movement of air outside that you have noticed all morning, and it passes through the nearest vine row with a sound like someone running their fingers lightly over rough paper, a brief dry whisper that stops as suddenly as it started. The mist in the hollow shifts slightly, a slow rolling motion that exposes the top of an alder tree and then covers it again, and then the breeze dies and the stillness returns, deeper than before because the brief disturbance has reminded you how complete the stillness is when undisturbed. The hen in the yard has stopped scratching and now stands on one leg, with her head tucked under her wing, a posture of rest that makes her look like a small grey boulder, and even she seems to be part of the silence now, contributing her own stillness to the general stillness of the morning. You check the fire over your shoulder, a quick glance across the room that tells you the embers are still glowing bright, and the flame is still steady on the vine log, and then you return your gaze to the window because the fire needs nothing from you, and the view outside needs nothing from you, and the you outside needs nothing from you, and you need nothing from either of them except to be there, to be the consciousness that observes the silence, and by observing it, becomes part of it. The distillery behind you hums its low, continuous note. The flame crackles softly. The copper ticks once as it continues its slow expansion. And these sounds are not interruptions to the silence, but rather the framework around which the silence is built. The way a few notes of music can define the rests between them. You notice, without any feeling of urgency or concern, that the mist on the hills to the east has begun to thin perceptibly, the grey light growing just a shade brighter and the outlines of the distant stands of trees becoming slightly more defined, and you know that by midday, if the clouds do not thicken again, the mist will have pulled back to the river and the hollow will be clear enough to see the stream glinting through the alders. But midday is still some time away, and you are in no hurry for it to arrive, because the morning silence is a gift that you do not squander by wishing for a different hour, a different light, a different season. You accept the grey and the stillness and the quiet exactly as they are given, and you stand at the window for a small space of time that cannot be measured in minutes, your hands resting on the worn chestnut sill, your eyes moving slowly across the familiar territory of the empty vineyard, your breath forming small clouds that merge with the mist beyond the glass. Eventually you feel the fire's warmth behind you pull at your attention, a gentle request rather than a demand, and you take one last look at the yard, at the sleeping hen, at the stacked baskets, at the empty lane, before you turn back toward the room. The transition from looking outside to looking inside is marked by the change in light, from the cool grey of the window to the warm orange of the firebox, and your eyes take a moment to adjust, during which you see the alembic standing in its place like a faithful servant that has waited for your return without complaint, the copper now fully warm and glowing with a deep rose-gold luster that throws soft reflections onto the stone walls. You walk back to the stool, your shoes making the same soft sound on the flagstones that they made earlier, and you sit down facing the fire, and the silence of the vineyard seems to follow you inside and settle around you like a cloak, so that even as you reach for the poker to adjust the embers, you are still, in some part of your awareness, standing at the window watching the mist move slowly across the dormant vines. The moment you have been waiting for arrives not with a signal or a sound, but with a change in the air near the spout, a slight thickening of the scent that has been drifting through the distillery for the past hour. And you notice it before you see anything because your senses have been tuned by years of practice to detect the shift from vapor to liquid even before the first drop forms. You rise from the stool and cross to the end of the cooling worm where the copper tube emerges from the water barrel and bends downward into a short, curved spout, no longer than your hand, its opening shaped like a small lip that directs the falling spirit into whatever vessel you place beneath it. You have placed a clear glass cup there, the one you took down from the shelf earlier, and it sits directly under the spout on a small wooden block that raises it to the correct height, its mouth open and waiting. The air around the spout has a different quality now, a slight coolness that comes from the cold water in the barrel meeting the warm vapor inside the coil, and you hold your palm a few inches beneath the opening to feel for any mist that might precede the liquid. And at first there is nothing, only the faint draft from the window stirring the hairs on the back of your hand. And then a very fine fog touches your skin, so light you might have imagined it, a ghost of moisture that evaporates before you can be sure it was there. This is the leading edge of the vapor that has traveled all the way from the pot through the swan's neck and the coil, condensing at the very end of its journey, and it announces that the first true drop is only moments away. You withdraw your hand and wipe it on your apron, and you stand quite still, your eyes fixed on the copper lip, breathing slowly so that your breath does not disturb the delicate process taking place at the boundary between hot and cold. The first drop appears as a swelling at the very tip of the spout, a tiny bead of clear liquid that gathers itself from the invisible fog inside the copper, growing larger as you watch, catching the firelight and holding it like a jewel, round and perfect and trembling slightly with the vibration of the still. It hangs there for what feels like a long time, though in truth it is only a few seconds, and the entire room seems to pause with it, the fire lowering its voice and the copper ceasing its creaks, as though everything is waiting for this one small event. Then the drop becomes too heavy to hold, its weight overcoming the surface tension that kept it attached to the metal, and it falls straight down into the glass cup with a sound so small and so clean that it is less a sound and more a punctuation mark in the silence. A single note that says, "Begin." You look into the cup and see the first drop lying at the bottom. A tiny pool, no wider than a thumbnail, perfectly clear and perfectly still, and the light from the fire passes through it and turns it into a lens of pale gold, even though the liquid itself has no color, only the suggestion of color borrowed from the flames. The smell rises immediately from the cup, concentrated and vivid, and you lean down to draw it in with a slow breath that fills your nose and the back of your throat with the raw soul of the wine. It is green at first, a fresh, sharp note like crushed stems and unripe fruit, and then beneath the green there is a floral sweetness, a hint of vine flowers and meadow herbs, and beneath that a soft burn that is not heat, but the promise of alcohol, a clean ethanol prickle that makes your nostrils flare slightly, before it fades and leaves behind a ghost of pear skin and wet stone. You bring the cup closer to your face without lifting it from the block, and the smell changes as it meets the warmer air near your skin, releasing new layers that were hidden before. The faintest trace of the yeast that fermented the wine, a bread-like comfort that underlies the sharper notes, and something else that is harder to name. Something else that is harder to name, something that might be the memory of the soil the vines grew in, the chalky limestone that gives the grapes their acid backbone, and will one day give the aged spirit its length and its linger. This first drop is called the brulee in the language of distillers, the raw first-run spirit that will later be distilled again into the finished eau de vie, and it contains everything the wine held, concentrated and intensified, the good and the bad and the indifferent, all mixed together in a summary of everything that came before, but is at once a beginning and a summary of everything that came before. A second drop forms at the spout while you are still examining the first, this one arriving more quickly than its predecessor, and it falls with the same small note into the cup, where it merges with the first drop and widens the tiny pool, and then a third drop comes behind it, and the rhythm begins. The interval between drops is about 3 of your quiet breaths, a slow count that you fall into automatically, breathing in as the drop forms and breathing out as it falls, so that your body becomes a clock marking the pace of the distillation. This is the heartbeat of the still, too slow to be called a flow and too steady to be called intermittent. A deliberate drip that will continue for many hours before the run is complete, unchanged in its rhythm, except when the fire needs adjustment or the cooling water warms enough to slow the condensation. And you will be here for all of it, watching and waiting and breathing in time with the copper lip. You step back from the spout and return to the stool, leaving the glass cup in place to collect the spirit, and the view from your stool frames the alembic against the firelight in a composition you have seen so many times it feels like the natural arrangement of the universe. The drip continues its slow pace, and the sound of it, once you have stopped paying direct attention to it, becomes part of the background of the room, joining the fire's whisper and the copper's creak and the distant murmur of the chimney drawer to form a quiet music that you do not so much hear as inhabit. You pour yourself a little more water from the pitcher, the cup cool in your hand, and you drink it slowly while your eyes rest on the copper dome, without focusing on anything in particular, your thoughts drifting in the same unhurried way as the mist outside the window. The fire needs a new stick of wood every quarter hour or so, a ritual without urgency, and you have placed a small pile of split vine branches within reach of the stool so that you do not need to stand up each time. When you notice the flame growing thinner and the embers losing their bright orange glow, you reach for a piece no thicker than your wrist, a twist of old grapevine with bark like rough leather, and you open the firebox door and lay it gently on the embers. The wood catches within a few heartbeats, the flames licking up around it with renewed appetite, and the heat in the room pulses slightly before settling back to its steady output. You close the door most of the way and return your hand to your lap, and the whole action has taken no more time than the interval between 2 drops from the spout, integrated so smoothly into the rhythm of the morning that it feels less like a chore and more like a refrain in a song. The smell from the cup continues to evolve as the first few ounces of brulees collect, and the room is now filled with a fragrance that is stronger than before, not overwhelming, but present in every breath you take. The green, crushed stem note has softened somewhat, replaced by a rounder fruitiness that reminds you of the grapes themselves as they were at the moment of pressing, a sweet tart balance that catches at the sides of your tongue even though you are not tasting the liquid, only breathing its vapors. The floral undertone persists, a thread of white blossom that runs through the heavier scents and lifts them, and the ethanol prickle has become a warm background hum that you no longer notice unless you pay attention to it, which you do not, because there is no need to analyze what you are smelling, only to be aware of it as one more thread in the fabric of the morning. The glass cup slowly fills, the level rising by perhaps the width of a finger every half hour at this early stage, and the liquid remains perfectly clear with the faintest shimmer of gold from the firelight, a color that is not really color but a trick of the light that makes the brulees look as though it contains captured sunshine, which in a way it does, the sunshine of the past summer, stored in the grapes and released now through the heat of the fire. You watch the level rise without any need to measure it precisely because the volume of the first run is fixed by the amount of wine in the pot, and you know from experience that the brulees will continue to drip until about a third of the original liquid has passed through the still, leaving behind the weaker remains that will be discarded or added to the next batch. And this knowledge means you do not need to monitor the progress with numbers, only with your senses, which are more reliable than any instrument in a room where the light flickers and the temperature shifts with every opening and opening. A slight change in the drip rate catches your attention, the interval between drops lengthening by perhaps a breath, and you know that the fire has cooled just enough to slow the vapor production. You rise and cross to the firebox, open the door, and see that the last stick of vinewood has burned through, and the embers are beginning to hollow out in the center, where the air has consumed the heart of the fuel. You take it a longer piece of oak this time, a split section with a flat edge that will sit firmly on the grate, and you place it across the hollowed embers, pushing it gently with the poker until it settles into a position where the draft can reach its underside. The flames return within seconds, stronger now because the oak is denser than the vine and burns with more heat, and you leave the firebox door open a little wider to allow more air to reach the new fuel, adjusting the draft to match the hunger of the oak. While you are at the firebox, you glance at the copper pot above, and you notice that the patina on the dome has darkened further, the rose gold of the early morning now deepened to a rich brown gold that speaks of sustained heat and the long hours of the day still ahead. The swan's neck shows a faint bloom of oxidation where the hot vapor passes through, a darker streak that follows the curve of the pipe, and this is normal, a sign that the still is working at the correct temperature, the vapor carrying with it not only alcohol and water, but also trace compounds from the copper itself, which will later contribute to the flavor of the spirit in ways that no one fully understands but every distiller accepts as part of the ancient conversation between metal and wine. You lay your palm flat against the side of the dome for just a moment, feeling the deep, steady warmth that now radiates from the metal, a satisfying heat that tells you the fire is doing its job and the wine is giving up its essence drop by patient drop. You return to the stool, and the drip has resumed its former rhythm. The small pause caused by the cooling fire now corrected, and the glass cup continues its slow fill. The sound of the drops falling is so regular now that it has become a form of silence itself, the way the ticking of a clock in a quiet room eventually becomes invisible to the ear. And you sit in this silence that is not silence, with your hands folded and your eyes half closed, not sleeping, but not fully awake either, existing in the in-between state that the French call veille, the watch, the vigil, the state of being present without being active. In this state your mind does not wander so much as it settles, like the fine sediment in a bottle of old wine drifting to the bottom and leaving the liquid above perfectly clear. You think about the path this liquid has taken to arrive here, not as a story with a beginning and an end, but as a series of images that float through your awareness one after another. The bare vines outside the window, which all summer drew water from the chalky soil and pushed it into the swelling grapes, each berry a tiny reservoir of sun and stone. The pickers in September, their hands quick among the leaves as they snip the bunches and drop them into the baskets that now sit empty by the barn. The press house, with its great wooden screw creaking downward onto the mound of crushed fruit, the juice running pink and then clear into the trough beneath. The fermentation in the big oak vats, the yeast frothing on the surface like a living blanket. The sweet smell of the must giving way, day by day, to the sharper smell of young wine. And then the decanting, the settling, the careful transfer of the clear wine from the vat to the pot, leaving behind the lees that would have clouded the spirit. All of that effort, all those hands and hours, now reduced to this single stream of droplets falling into a glass cup in a quiet room while the October mist presses against the window, and the reduction does not feel like a loss, but like a concentration, a focusing of all that scattered work into a single point of light and flavor. You reach under the spout and lift the glass cup carefully with both hands, holding it at eye level to examine the liquid more closely. The cup is now perhaps a quarter full, the brulee swirling gently from the movement, and the swirl reveals the body of the spirit, which clings to the sides of the glass in slow-moving legs that trickle down at different speeds, the thicker compounds moving more slowly than the thinner ones. The smell rising from the open top of the cup is richer now, the green notes having given way almost entirely to the floral and the fruity, with a new hint of something like fresh hay or dried herbs, a complexity that was not present in the first drops and will not be present in the last, only in this middle portion of the run, the heart of the brewel. You tilt the cup slightly and watch the liquid move, its surface tension holding it in a slight curve above the rim before it settles back, and then you place the cup back under the spout with the same care you would use when setting down a sleeping child. The morning has now advanced well toward noon, though the light through the window remains the same pearly grey it has been since sunrise, the cloud cover too thick to let the sun declare its position in the sky. You can tell the hour roughly by the number of sticks you have added to the fire, a count you keep not as numbers but as a sense of accumulation. The way you know how many pages you have read in a book without counting them, simply by the thickness of the pages remaining in your right hand. The pile of split vine branches beside the stool has diminished by about a third. The empty space where the wood used to be marking the passage of time more clearly than any clock could, and the oak log you added most recently is now burning steadily, its dense grain releasing a long slow heat that will sustain the drip for another quarter hour before the next addition is needed. You hear, very faintly from the direction of the village, the sound of the church bell striking some hour that you do not bother to count, the tones reaching you as a series of low, mellow notes that are more felt than heard. A vibration in the air that passes through the distillery and disappears into the vineyard beyond. The bell is the only reminder you have received all morning that a world exists outside this room, and you receive it without any feeling of interruption or intrusion, simply as one more sound in the fabric of the day, no more important than the fire's crackle or the drip's quiet beat. The bell stops, and the silence rushes back in like water filling a hole in sand, and you return your attention to the spout where another drop is just now forming, trembling at the copper lip before it lets go and falls. The ritual of adding wood to the fire continues, a cycle that repeats without becoming repetitive because each piece of wood is slightly different, each flame that catches has its own shape and color, each adjustment of the firebox door produces a small variation in the sound of the draft. You feed the fire as you might feed a quiet animal that comes to your hand without demanding, taking what you offer and turning it into warmth. And the relationship between you and the fire is so old and so familiar that it no longer requires thought, only attention, an attention that is gentle and unfocussed and spreads across the whole room rather than fixing on any single point. The brewer's continues its slow accumulation, the level in the glass cup rising increment by increment, and you know that you will soon need to swap the cup for a larger vessel, a ceramic jug that waits on the floor beside the spout, its mouth wide enough to catch the falling drops without spilling. But not yet. The cup still has room for another inch of liquid, and there is no reason to hurry the exchange. Just as there is no reason to hurry anything in a day that stretches ahead of you as open and unmarked as the grey sky. You stay on the stool, your breathing aligned with the drip, your eyes moving lazily between the fire, the copper, the spout, and the window. And the slow calm of the morning wraps around you like the warmth from the firebox, steady and deep and without end. The church bell you heard a while ago has faded into the grey air, and something in the quality of the light, though it has not brightened, tells you that the morning has now crossed its midpoint and is sliding gently into the early afternoon. The mist outside has thinned enough that you can see the river as a faint silver line between the poplars when you glance toward the window. A glint of moving water that catches what little light exists and carries it downstream toward the town you never visit during the distilling season. Inside the room, the warmth has become a constant, a comfortable weight that presses against your skin without oppressing, and the smell of the brewless has settled into a steady fragrance that is now as much a part of the air as the smell of the old stones and the burnt oak. You notice a small hunger beginning to make itself known, not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but the gentle reminder that your body has been awake since before dawn and has received nothing but water from the clay pitcher. You rise from the stool, your legs stiff in a pleasant way from the long sitting, and you walk to the shelf near the door where you left a linen cloth wrapped around the morning's provisions, a round loaf of bread from the village baker, delivered 2 days ago and still moist inside its crust, a wedge of pale cheese that smells faintly of the herb the farmer's wife rubs on its honey, that you spoon onto the bread when you want something sweet and to the bread when you want something sweet. You carry these items back toward the firebox, not because the firebox is a table, but because it is the warmest spot in the room, and you settle yourself on the stool with the food spread on a clean wooden board across your knees. The bread tears under your fingers with a soft give, its inside revealing the irregular holes that mark a dough that rose slowly in a cool kitchen, and you pull off a piece no larger than an egg and hold it up to your nose for just a moment, before eating, catching the faint sourness of the leaven and the deeper toasted note from the oven's floor. You eat it plain at first, chewing slowly and feeling the crust soften between your teeth while the crumb dissolves into a mild sweetness that is the taste of wheat grown on the plateau above the river, ground at the mill whose wheel you can sometimes hear creaking when the water is high. The bread is good and solid, the kind of bread that sustains a person through a long day of watching and waiting, and you take another piece, and this time add a slice of the cheese, which is firm and slightly granular, and leaves a clean milky taste on your tongue that complements the bread's sour notes. While you eat, your eyes rest on the alembic with the same easy attention you would give to a companion who does not require conversation, and the drip from the spout continues its measured pace. The small sounds of each drop falling into the now half-full cup, marking a rhythm that is slower than your chewing and slower than your heartbeat, a deep bass note beneath the other rhythms of the room. The fire has burned down slightly while you were fetching the food, and you make a mental note to add a stick when you have finished eating. But the embers are still bright and the copper is still warm, and there is no urgency in the observation, only the calm cataloguing of small things that will need doing, eventually. You spoon a little of the honeyed walnuts onto a corner of bread, the honey thick and crystallized from the cool air so that it crunches slightly between your teeth, and the walnuts have absorbed the sweetness and given back their own earthy bitterness, a balance that the farmer's wife understands in the way that country people understand such things without recipes or measurements, only the long practice of making the same preserves year after year with the nuts that fall from the tree by the well. The food settles in your stomach with a warmth that joins the warmth of the fire, and you feel a deep contentment that has nothing to do with satisfaction and everything to do with the simple fact of being exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you should do, in a moment that asks nothing more of you than your presence. You pour water from the pitcher into your cup, and the water has now lost its morning chill entirely, sitting at the temperature of the room, which is the temperature of your skin, so that when you drink it the water seems to disappear into you without any sensation of hot or cold, only the clean mineral taste of the deep well and the faint memorial of the limestone it passed through. You drink the whole cup and pour another, and while you pour you watch the steady stream from the pitcher's spout, a larger and faster version of the brewlish drip that you have been watching all morning, and the parallel amuses you in a quiet way. The thought that you and the still are both engaged in the same activity of transferring liquid from one vessel to another, drop by drop, cup by cup, hour by hour. When you have finished eating, you fold the linen cloth around the remaining bread and cheese and set the board aside on the floor, and you wipe your fingers on your apron before reaching for the pile of firewood. The pile has shrunk considerably since the morning, the split vine branches reduced to a scatter of small pieces too thin to burn for more than a few minutes, and you make another mental note to bring more wood from the barn before the afternoon deepens. But again, there is no urgency, only the quiet arranging of future tasks in a corner of your mind that holds such things without anxiety. You select a piece of oak about the length of your forearm and as thick as your two thumbs together, a good solid piece with a flat grain that will burn evenly, and you open the firebox door and lay it on the embers with the same deliberate motion you have used all morning. The flames, which had subsided to a low blue shimmer on the surface of the coals, brighten immediately and wrap around the new wood, and the firebox glows warmer, the light pulsing gently against your face and hands. You check the cooling water in the worm barrel by dipping your finger into it, and the water has warmed somewhat from the constant condensation of hot vapor inside the copper coil, but it is still cool enough that you feel no need to change it yet. The barrel holds perhaps 40 gallons, enough to condense a full run of brewels without overheating, and the water was drawn fresh from the well last evening and allowed to sit overnight so that any sediment would settle, and it sits now as clear and dark as a mirror, reflecting the copper coil in distorted curves that shift when you touch the surface. A small trickle of condensation runs down the outside of the barrel where the cold water meets the warmer air of the room, and this trickle has worn a faint green stain on the oak staves, a miniature moss that grows only in the distilling season and disappears during the dry months of summer. You wipe your finger on your apron and return to the stool. The drip rate has remained steady during your meal, the fire adjustment holding true, and you lean back against the wall behind the stool, your shoulders finding a hollow in the stone that has been worn smooth by generations of distillers leaning in exactly the same spot. The wall is not cold because the warmth of the fire has penetrated even the massive stones of the old farmhouse, and the stone feels almost alive against your back, a solid presence that holds you upright without effort. You let your head rest against the stone as well, and your eyes close not because you are tired, but because there is no need to keep them open. The room is so familiar that you can see it perfectly well without sight. The firebox glowing to your left, the copper dome rising before you, the spout dripping to your left, The copper dome rising before you, the spout dripping to your right, the window behind you with its rectangle of grey light falling across the floor, the candle on the shelf now burned down to a stub and no longer necessary. Every sound confirms the picture. The crackle and the drip and the low hum and the distant murmur of the river. And you rest in this darkness behind your eyelids as comfortably as you rest in the light. In this state between waking and sleeping, you become aware of the slower rhythms of the room that are usually hidden beneath the surface of attention, and you feel the way the heat from the fire arrives in slow waves that travel across the flagstones and rise up the walls, the way the draft from the window slides along the floor and meets the heat at a boundary somewhere near your feet, where the two temperatures mix and cancel each other into a neutral zone. The way the copper dome expands and contracts almost imperceptibly. With each smile, the room is alive in its own way, not with the life of animals or plants, but with the life of heat moving through matter. A slow circulation that is as old as the earth itself and will continue long after the last drop of this brewless has fallen and the last ember has cooled to ash. You open your eyes again after a span that might have been minutes or might have been half an hour. You have no way of knowing and no desire to know, and the room looks exactly as it did when you closed them, the fire burning, the copper glowing, the drip falling, the mist hanging beyond the window. The only change is in the glass cup under the spout, which is now more than half full and will soon need to be swapped for the larger jug. And you note this with the same calm attention you give to all the other details of the room. Filing it away is a task that will need doing, but not yet, not quite yet. You stretch your legs out in front of you and cross your ankles on the flagstones, and the small shift in position is enough to refresh your body without disturbing your mind, which remains in that pleasant state of diffuse awareness that the French call la veille, the watch, the vigil of the distiller. The brulees in the cup has now risen high enough that you can see its surface tension from across the room, a slight curve at the rim where the liquid climbs the glass before falling back on itself. And the colour when the firelight passes through it is no longer the borrowed gold of the first few drops, but a true pale straw, the colour of dry winter grass or the inside of an apple seed. This colour comes from nothing added, only from the concentration of the wine's essence, and it will deepen again during the second distillation when the spirit is refined into the clear heart of the cognac. But for now it is the colour of the brewers, humble and honest, the colour of something in its first unfinished state. You think about the second distillation, which will begin tomorrow or perhaps the day after, depending on the pace of this first run, and the thought does not hurry you because the bon chauffe, the good heating, requires even more patience than the brûlé, a smaller fire and a slower drip and a more careful cut between the heads and the heart and the tails. But tomorrow is tomorrow, and today is today, and the only task that exists in this moment is to watch the drip, to feed the fire, to breathe the warm fragrant air, and to let the hours pass in their own quiet manner, without pulling at them or pushing them or wishing them to be anything other than what they are. You rise and stretch your arms above your head, feeling the muscles in your shoulders lengthen and release, and you walk to the window for no reason other than to move your body after the long sitting. The view outside has changed very little since you last looked. The same rows of bare vines, the same poplars by the river, the same bank of mist in the hollow. But the light has shifted slightly toward the west, so that the shadows, such as they are in this grey day, now fall at a different angle across the yard. The hen has moved from her spot and is now pecking at something near the base of the barn wall, and a second hen has joined her, a darker bird with a red comb that stands out against the grey day like a single ember. The two birds move together in a slow circuit of the yard, their heads bobbing in unsynchronized rhythms, and their presence is the only sign that the farm is inhabited by anything other than yourself and the still and the patient fire. You stand at the window for a while, one hand resting on the sill, the other hanging at your side, and you let the cool air wash over your face while the warmth of the fire presses against your back, and the contrast is pleasant in a way that is hard to describe. A balance of opposites that sums to a feeling of being exactly at the boundary between two realms. The window is your connection to the outside world, the world of vines and mist and hens and the distant church spire, and the fire is your connection to the inside world, the world of copper and vapor and the slow transformation of fruit into spirit and you occupy the space between them as naturally as a stone occupies the bed of a stream. Unmoving while the current flows around it, when you turn back to the room, the light from the window falls on the flagstones in a pale rectangle that has crept closer to the firebox since you last noticed it, a silent sundial marking the slow rotation of the earth, and you step over the rectangle and return to the stool. The drip from the spout has slowed slightly again, the interval between drops now perhaps 4 breaths instead of 3, and you know that this is the natural decline of the run as the alcohol in the wine becomes less concentrated and the vapor rises more reluctantly from the pot. You add another stick to the fire, a piece of vine this time rather than oak, because the vine burns hotter and faster and will give the vapor a final push before the brulee begins to weaken noticeably. And you want to collect every drop of the spirit before cutting the run and preparing for the next charge. The vine stick catches with a flare of yellow flame that throws dancing shadows onto the walls, and the copper dome responds with a soft ping that echoes in the upper reaches of the room. And for a few minutes the drip quickens slightly, the drops falling at intervals of 2 breaths, until the extra heat has done its work and the rate settles back to its regular pulse. You watch this small correction with satisfaction, the feeling of having nudged the process back into alignment, and you return your hands to your lap and your attention to the wide, unfocused awareness that has become your default state through the long hours of the morning and the early afternoon. The smell of the brulee continues to shift, the fruity notes now dominant and the green notes all but gone, replaced by something warmer and rounder that you recognize as the precursor of the aged spirit's future character, the hint of dried apricot and almond that will emerge fully only after years in the oak barrels, but that is present even now in seed form, waiting. You breathe in this smell with each slow inhalation, and it becomes a kind of nourishment in its own right, feeding something in you that is not hunger and not thirst, but a need for beauty, for the quiet satisfaction of sensing something lovely being born from simple materials. The day continues its slow arc, the light outside the window holding steady in its grey diffusion, the mist neither lifting nor thickening, the temperature neither rising nor falling, and the distillery hums along its course with the reliability of a boat moving down a slow river, no faster than the current, no slower than the tide. You are the boatman, the watcher, the tender of the fire, and your only duty is to remain, to attend, to be present for each drop as it falls and each flame as it flickers, and each moment as it passes into the next, indistinguishable and precious and calm. The drip has slowed to the point where you can no longer count it as a rhythm. The falls coming now at irregular intervals that stretch longer and longer as the alcohol in the wine pot dwindles and the vapor thins, and you recognize this change as the beginning of the end of the first run. The moment when the bruilis begins to weaken and the distiller must decide when to cut the stream and set aside what remains for the next charge. You rise from the stool and cross to the spout, your legs moving with the heavy ease of muscles that have rested long and are ready to work again, and you lift the glass cup carefully with both hands, holding it up to the grey light from the window where it glows, the colour of pale honey, a colour that has deepened over the hours as the spirit concentrated itself, drop by drop, into the cup. The cup is now nearly full, the surface of the bruilis trembling slightly with the vibration of the still and reflecting the window as a tiny rectangle of lighter grey, and you bring it close to your face to smell the spirit at this late stage of the run. The fragrance has changed again since you last paid close attention, the bright fruity notes of the middle run now fading into something softer and flatter, a scent that is still pleasant, but thinner, with a faint hint of wet cardboard and boiled vegetables that tells you the tails are approaching, the less desirable compounds that come at the end of every distillation, and must be separated from the heart. This is the moment the old distillers call the coupe, the cut, the decision point that separates the good spirit from the indifferent, and you make the decision not with a thermometer or a clock, but with your nose and your memory and the accumulated wisdom of all the years you have stood in this room watching this same transition. You set the full cup on the shelf beside the candle stub, placing it carefully on a flat section of the wood where it will not tip, and you reach for the ceramic jug that has been waiting on the floor beside the spout, a tall vessel with a narrow neck and a wide belly, its glaze the color of old cream and its handle shaped to fit the curve of a thumb and 2 fingers. The jug is heavy even when empty, the clay thick enough to keep the spirit cool, and you position it under the spout with the same precise attention you gave to the glass cup hours ago, adjusting the wooden block beneath it so that the lip of the spout clears the rim by exactly the width of your smallest finger. When the jug is settled, you pour the contents of the glass cup into it in a long, slow stream that glugs softly at the narrow neck, the brulee settling into its new container with a sound like a stone dropping into a deep well, and then you place the empty cup beside the jug and return your attention to the slowing drip. The interval between drops has now stretched to 7 or 8 breaths, and the character of each drop has changed visibly, the liquid coming off the spout less viscous than before, its surface tension lower so that the drops are smaller and fall more quickly once they form, and the smell rising from the jug has that faint cardboard note you detected in the cup. Stronger now, a sign that the alcohol content is rising and the run is very near its useful end. You watch one more drop fall, and then another, and you lean close to the spout to catch the scent of the third drop before it falls, and the boiled vegetable note is now unmistakable, a dull, flat smell that has none of the brightness or fruit of the heart, and you know that the brulee is finished. The cut is simple and requires no tools, only your 2 hands and a clean linen rag that hangs from a hook beside the spout. You lift the ceramic jug away from the spout with one hand and set it on the floor at a safe distance, and then you take the empty glass cup and place it back under the spout to catch the remaining liquid, which will now be mostly water with a small amount of alcohol still clinging to it, too weak to include in the bon chauffe, but still useful for other purposes. The drops continue to fall into the glass cup, but you are no longer watching them with the same attention because the important part of the run is over. The heart of the brulee is safe in the ceramic jug, and what remains is only the rinsing of the still, the final weak output that the old distillers call the petites osiers, the small waters, which will be added to the next batch of wine before distillation to capture whatever spirit they still contain. You carry the ceramic jug to the heavy oak table that stands against the wall near the barrels, a table whose top is scarred with the rings of countless jugs and cups set down over the centuries, and you place the jug at the center of the table where it will be safe while you finish the day's work. The jug holds perhaps 2 gallons of brulis, the concentrated essence of a full charge of wine that began the morning as 600 liters of pale liquid and has now been reduced to a fraction of its original volume, and the transformation feels almost miraculous when you stop to think about it, which you rarely do, because the miracle is so familiar that it has become simply the way things are. The way wine becomes spirit and spirit becomes cognac and cognac becomes time itself captured in a form and tasted. You return to the firebox and open the door fully, and the heat rushes out to meet you with the force of a fire that has been burning for many hours. Its bed of embers now deep and glowing with a fierce orange light that makes you squint slightly as you peer into it. The fire has done its work for this run and needs now to be reduced, not extinguished entirely because you will need it again for the second charge, but brought down to a low-maintenance heat that will keep the copper warm and the room comfortable while you prepare for the next stage. You take the poker and spread the embers into a thinner layer, pushing some of them to the back of the firebox where they will burn more slowly, and you close the door most of the way, leaving only a small gap for air, and immediately the fierce glow dims and the heat in the room begins its slow decline toward the gentler warmth of the afternoon. The water barrel that holds the cooling coil is now warm to the touch, the 40 gallons having absorbed the heat of the distilled vapor over many hours, and you know that before the second charge you will need to draw fresh cold water from the well to bring the temperature back down. You dip a bucket into the barrel, a wooden bucket with a rope handle that has been used for this purpose since your grandfather's time, and you lift it full of the warm water, which you carry to the door and pour out onto the flagstones of the yard outside, where it spreads in a dark fan that the hens will investigate later. You repeat this process 5 times, each bucketful reducing the level in the barrel and the warmth of what remains, and then you carry fresh water from the well in the yard, the bucket heavy on your shoulder as you walk back through the door, the cold water sloshing slightly over the rim and leaving dark spots on the stones. The fresh water pours into the barrel with a hollow roar that is the loudest sound you have heard all day, and the copper coil inside the barrel pings once as the cold water hits it, a sharp note of thermal contraction that fades as quickly as it came. The well water is so cold that it makes your fingers ache when you dip them into the barrel to check the level. A deep, penetrating cold that comes from the same aquifer that feeds the river. And you know that this coldness will be enough to condense the vapors of the second run, even at the slower pace that the bon chauffe requires. You add buckets until the barrel is full again, the water now so clear and cold that you can see every detail of the copper coil winding through it, every joint and curve and the small patina of green that marks the places where the metal has been submerged for season after season. And when the barrel is full, you set the bucket aside and dry your hands on your apron and allow yourself a moment of stillness before the next phase of work begins. The alembic now needs to be emptied of the spent lees, the boiled wine that remains in the pot after the alcohol has been drawn off, and this is a task that requires more effort than the watching and the waiting of the morning, but still no hurry, a methodical sequence of actions that you have performed so many times that your body does it without consulting your mind. You walk to the back of the still where a small drain pipe leads from the base of the pot through the stone wall and into a trench outside that carries the waste to the midden heap, and you open the wooden tat that seals the pipe. A simple cone-shaped plug that fits into its socket with a friction that requires a firm pull to release. The lees flow out in a thick brown stream that smells of cooked grapes and yeast, and something else that is hard to name but familiar, the smell of spent effort, of wine that has given everything it had and now returns to the earth from which it came. The stream gurgles through the pipe, and you listen to it drain, the sound gradually thinning from a pour to a trickle to a series of slow drips that echo the Barilla strip you've been listening to all morning. A symmetry that pleases you in a quiet way. When the pot is empty, you close the tap firmly, pushing the wooden plug back into its seat with the heel of your hand, and you check the seal by running a dry finger around the joint, which is as tight as it needs to be. The pot is now ready for its second charge, but before you refill it, you will clean the copper dome and the swan's neck with a flush of clean water, a rinsing that removes any residue from the first run and ensures that the second distillation begins with nothing but the brewless and the water you will add to it. You lift a bucket of the cold well water and pour it through the opening at the top of the dome, where the wine was introduced this morning, and the water runs down through the pot and out the drain pipe, with a rushing sound that is cleaner and brighter than the sound of the lees, a fresh sound that announces the preparation for the next stage. The ceramic jug of Brouillet sits waiting on the oak table, and you lift it with both hands, feeling its weight and the slight warmth that still clings to it from the distillation, and you carry it carefully back toward the still. You will pour the Brouillets into the pot, add the small waters from the previous run that you saved in a separate container, and top up the mixture with clean well water until the liquid reaches the correct level, a proportion that you know by the sight of the surface through the inspection window rather than by measurement, a visual judgment that has become second nature over the years. The Brouillet glugs into the pot with the same sound it made when you transferred it from the cup, a sound that seems to belong specifically to this liquid and no other, rich and round, and somehow serious, as though the spirit knows its own importance and announces it with every pour. You add the small waters, the weak tails from the previous distillation that you collected in a glass bottle marked with a scratch on its side, and then you add bucket after bucket of cold well water, pausing between each addition to watch the level rise through the small round windows set into the side of the pot, a window made of thick glass that has survived years of heating and cooling without cracking, because it was made by a glass blower in the village who understood the secret of annealing, cooling the glass so slowly that the internal stresses dissolved behind a material that could cal. The window shows you the liquid inside the pot, a pale mixture that is clearer than the original wine because the Brouillet carries none of the grape solids or the yeast sediment, only the alcohol and the water and the volatile compounds that give the spirit its character, and the level rises slowly until it reaches a mark on the copper that you have watched for decades, a small scratch made by your father with the point of a nail, invisible to anyone who does not know to look for it but as clear to you as a written instruction. When the pot is charged, you seal the inspection window with its copper cover and check the joint between the dome and the base where the flour and water paste has dried and cracked during the first run. And you mix a fresh handful of paste from the small bowl of flour you keep on the shelf, adding water from your cup and working the mixture between your fingers until it forms a stiff grey dough that you press into the joint with your thumb, smoothing it flat and tight, so that no vapor will escape. The paste is cool and slightly gritty against your skin, and the smell of the wet flour mingles with the other smells of the room. A clean, bland note that will bake hard in the heat of the second fire and seal the still for the long, slow distillation to come. The light through the window has now shifted noticeably toward the west, the grey rectangle on the flagstones having crept further across the room and begun to climb the lower stones of the wall near the barrel, and you know that the afternoon is well advanced, even though the quality of the light has not changed. The clouds as thick as they were at dawn, and the mist still clinging to the hollow by the river. The shadows in the corners of the distillery have deepened slightly, the candle on the shelf having long since guttered out, and the firelight now provides the only illumination beyond the grey glow from the window, painting the room in shades of orange and amber and dark brown, colours that belong to the earth and the fire and the copper, the colours of the distiller's world. You take a moment to stand quite still in the centre of the room, your hands resting at your sides, your weight even on both feet, and you feel the deep tiredness that comes not from labour but from attention. The pleasant ache of having watched and waited for many hours, and you stretch your neck from side to side and roll your shoulders and feel the blood move more freely through muscles that have been still too long. The room around you is quiet now. The drip of the brulee stops and the fire reduced and the pot charged and waiting, and for a brief span of time there is nothing that needs doing. No adjustment to make, no esmond to watch, no fuel to add. You stand in this pause and let it be a pause, not rushing to fill it, not feeling any need to move on to the next task. Simply being in the room with the glowing copper and the warm stones and the grey light fading slowly toward the evening. You think about the second distillation that will begin soon, the bon chauve that turns the brulees into the true spirit, and you know that this next run will require even more care than the first, a smaller fire and a slower drip and a more precise cut between the heads and the heart and the tails, the heads being the first vapours that rise from the pot and carry with them the sharp, volatile compounds that must be discarded, the heart being the pure spirit that will go into the barrels, and the tails being the weak end that will be saved for the next cycle. But that work belongs to the evening and the night, and right now the pot is still cold, and the fire is still low, and the afternoon has not yet given way to the dusk, and so you stand in the pause and let it wrap around you like the grey mist outside the window, calm and quiet and complete. The freshly charged pot sits heavy on its brick base, the copper dome rising above it with the patient dignity of a thing that knows its purpose, and the firebox glows softly through the gap in its door, the embers arranged in their thin layer and waiting to be roused, and the newly filled water barrel reflects the firelight as a wavering orange shimmer on its dark surface, and the ceramic jug on the table holds the morning's labour captured in pale gold, and everything is in order. Everything is as it should be. In the small stone at the end of the harbour the sun is tide. You return to the stool and sit down, your hands folding automatically in your lap, and you close your eyes for just a moment, not to sleep but to rest them from the firelight. And in the darkness behind your lids you can still see the copper dome and the flame and the slow, steady drip of the brulees, a memory already forming from the morning that has passed, a memory that will join all the other mornings you have spent in this room, indistinguishable and precious, each one the same and each one unique. The pause you allowed yourself has passed, and now the room calls you back to work with the gentle insistence of a task that will not hurry but will not wait forever either. The second distillation waiting inside the charged pot like a seed, waiting in dark soil for the warmth that will wake it. You open your eyes, and the firelight greets you unchanged, the thin bed of embers still glowing behind the half-closed door, and you know that the time has come to wake the fire fully and begin the bon chauffe, the good heating, the second and more delicate passage of the spirit through the copper. The fire for the bon chauffe must be smaller than the fire for the brulee, more discreet, more controlled, because the liquid in the pot is now more volatile and more precious, already concentrated once and now to be concentrated once and now to be concentrated again into its final form, and a fire that is too hot will push the vapours through too fast, mixing the heads and the heart and the tails into a confusion that no amount of barrel aging can untangle. You kneel before the firebox and open the door fully, and the embers greet you with a soft orange glow that has none of the fierce white heat of the morning's peak, but is still alive, still waiting, still ready to serve. You take a small bundle of the thinnest vine twigs, pieces no thicker than a quill and brittle as old paper, and you lay them gently on the embers in a loose lattice that leaves plenty of space for air. And then you lean close and blow across the embers in the same long, slow breath you used at dawn, a breath that carries just enough oxygen to wake the flames without startling them. The twigs catch with a sound like a small sigh, a whisper of fire that spreads from twig to twig in a chain reaction of light, and the flames that rise are different from the morning's flames, smaller and bluer and more transparent, flames that seem to float just above the wood rather than consuming it. And this is exactly what the bon chauffe needs, a gentle heat that will warm the pot slowly and raise the vapors gradually, degree by patient degree. You add a few more twigs, and then a single thin split of oak no wider than your thumb, and you sit back on your heels to watch the fire establish itself in its new, quieter mode, the flames dancing with a restraint that matches the grey afternoon light falling through the window. The smell of wet copper rises briefly as the dome begins to warm again, a clean metallic tang that comes from the rinsing water you poured through the still during the cleaning, the last traces of moisture evaporating from the inner surface of the metal and carrying with them the scent of the well water and the faint memory of the morning's brewis. And this smell is sharper and fresher than anything else in the room, cutting through the wood smoke and the yeast and the old stone like a single clear note in the low slow chord. You breathe it in and hold it for a moment before releasing, and the smell fades as the copper dries and the temperature climbs past the point where water can linger, replaced by the subtler scent of warm metal and the first shy vapors rising from the pot. The second distillation is a slower process than the first, not because the principles are different, but because everything is more delicate now, the margins narrower, the consequences of haste more lasting, and you settle onto the stool with the knowledge that the evening will be long and the night longer still. The bon chauffe stretching into the dark hours while the world outside the window fades from grey to black, and the stars appear one in the gaps between the clouds, while the world outside the window fades from grey to black and the stars appear one in the gaps. You are not troubled by this knowledge because you have done it many times before, and the night in the distillery has its own character, its own quiet pleasures, the firelight seeming brighter against the dark, and the copper glowing with a deeper warmth, and the spirit running from the spout with a sound that belongs to the small hours, a sound that no one hears except the distiller and the sleeping hens and the mist moving over the river. You rise and check the seal on the inspection window and the joint around the dome, running your thumb over the fresh flour paste that is already beginning to dry and harden in the warmth, and you find it smooth and unbroken, a good seal that will hold the vapors inside where they belong. The pot is warming now, the lowest part of the copper beginning to brighten from its dull brown to a soft rose gold, and you place your palm near the metal without touching it, feeling the heat as a presence rather than a temperature, a living warmth that grows with each passing minute and each small stick of oak you add to the fire. The room seems to breathe more slowly as the afternoon fades toward dusk, the shadows in the corners deepening and the firelight growing more dominant, and you notice this change without remarking on it, simply accepting the slow transition from day to evening as you have accepted every other transition in this long quiet day. The window, when you glance toward it, shows a sky that has darkened slightly, the grey clouds now tinged with a faint charcoal undertone that speaks of the approaching night, and the mist in the hollow has thickened again, rising from the river like a second twilight that comes from the ground rather than the sky. You light a fresh candle from the embers of the fire, touching the wick to a small twig that you use as a taper, and the new flame rises straight and yellow in the still air, adding its small contribution to the light in the room and marking the official beginning of the evening watch. The first vapors of the bon chauffe reach your nose before you expect them, the smaller fire having done its work more quickly than you anticipated, or perhaps the time has passed faster than you realized while you sat in the quiet with your thoughts drifting, and you catch the scent as a faint suggestion at the edge of your awareness, something that was not there a moment ago and now is. You lean forward on the stool, unclose your eyes the better to ice it's the barely perceptible and let them arrive at their own pace. First a hint of dried apricots, the same apricots that grow against the south wall of the farmhouse and ripen in late July, their flesh turning from gold to deep orange and concentrating its sweetness under the sun. And then beneath the apricots a thread of fresh hay, the smell of the meadow after the scythe that hath. The crest rays in the syndicat the blaze. The numbst look at. You open your eyes and the room looks the same, but feels different. The arrival of these first fine vapors having changed the atmosphere in some way that you cannot name. And you rise and walk to the spout, where the empty glass cup still sits on its wooden block, waiting to receive the first drops of the second run. The spout is still dry, the copper lip cool to the touch because the vapors have not yet reached the cooling coil, but the smell around the spout is already beginning to change, the clean metallic scent of the copper giving way to that faint apricot hay fragrance that tells you the spirit is on its way, moving through the swan's neck and down toward the cold water that will turn it back into liquid. You return to the firebox and add another thin split of oak, feeding the flames with the same careful restraint you have maintained since the beginning of the bon chauffe, and you adjust the door gap to a width no greater than your smallest finger, which is all the air this fire needs to sustain its quiet burn. The draught moves through the firebox with a sound that is less a roar and more a hum, a low vibration that you feel in your chest as much as you hear with your ears, and the copper dome above you pings once softly and then falls silent, having expanded as much as it needs to for this lower temperature. The afternoon has now definitively become evening, the light through the window reduced to a pale wash of grey that barely illuminates the nearest vine rows, and leaves the rest of the vineyard to the darkness and the mist. And you know that soon you will need to close the shutter entirely against the night, damp, but not yet, not while there is still a trace of day in the sky and a trace of fresh air to feed the fire. You stand at the window for a moment, looking out at the world that has kept you company all day with its grey stillness, and you see that the hens have gone to roost in the barn, and the lane is now invisible in the gathering dark, and the only movement anywhere is the mist itself, which has begun to drift in slow coils across the fields, rising from the river and spreading over the vines like a second blanket laid down for the night. The first drop of the bon chauffe falls while you are standing at the window, and you hear it rather than see it, the small clean sound of spirit meeting glass that you have been listening for all afternoon, and you turn from the window and cross to the spout with a feeling that is not excitement but a deep quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of a thing beginning well. The drop sits at the bottom of the glass cup, a single bead of liquid that is clearer and brighter than the brewless was, the colour of diamond rather than straw, and when you lift the cup and bring it to your nose, the fragrance is so concentrated and so pure that it stops your breath for just a moment. A rush of pear and white flowers and something like crushed almond shells, and underneath it all the clean sharp presence of alcohol that is stronger now than it was in the first run, more refined, more itself. You have entered the phase of the distillation that the old distillers call the heads, the premiers, the first vapors that rise from the pot and carry with them the most volatile compounds, the sharpest edges of the spirit that must be set aside, because they are too rough and too strong to include in the heart. These heads smell of solvent and green apple, and something almost metallic, a smell that is not unpleasant but is not what you want in the finished cognac, and you will collect them in a separate vessel and add them to the next batch of brewery, where they will have another chance to be refined. But for now you simply watch the first few drops fall, noting their clarity and their pungency, and you place the cup back under the spout to continue its work. The fire burns steadily in its low restrained mode, and the drip from the spout establishes its own rhythm, a rhythm that is even slower than the brewless drip, the interval between drops perhaps 5 or 6 breaths because the heat is lower and the vapor is rising more reluctantly, and this slowness is exactly what you want, because the slower the distillation the cleaner heads and heart and tails, the purer the spirit that will emerge from the middle of the run. You sit on the stool and fold your hands and let the rhythm take you, breathing in time with the drops, and the evening deepens around you with the same slowness, the darkness outside the window becoming complete, and the candle on the shelf becoming the brightest thing in the room after the firebox. You think about the barrels waiting in the cool pantry beyond the distillery door, the barrels made from oak about the cooper who comes in the spring, and you think about how this spirit, this clear bright liquid that is now falling drop by drop into the glass cup, will sleep in those barrels for years and years, slowly taking color from the wood and slowly losing its sharp edges to the gentle chemistry of oxidation and evaporation, and one day someone will state. But that is far in the future, and you're in the present, on your stool, watching the fire, breathing the scent of apricots and hay, and the future can wait as patiently as you have waited all through this long, slow day. The heads continue to fall, the sharp green apple note gradually softening as the first volatile compounds are drawn off, and the heart of the spirit begins to approach, and you know that soon you will need to make the second cut. The most important cut of all, the moment when you decide that the heads are finished, and the heart has begun, and the true spirit is ready to be collected. But that moment is not yet here, and you do not hurry toward it, sitting instead in the quiet evening with the firelight on your face, and the copper glowing above you, and the drip continuing its slow, steady beat. A beat that will carry you through the night and into the morning of another day. The cut from heads to heart comes not as a sudden decision, but as a slow recognition, a gradual awareness that the sharp green apple scent has faded from the spirit falling into the glass cup and has been replaced by something rounder, deeper, more complete. And you notice this change the way you notice the seasons turning, not on a particular day, but over a span of time that has no clear boundary, yet is unmistakable once it has passed. You lift the cup from under the spout and bring it to your nose, and the smell that rises to meet you is no longer the solvent sharp tang of the heads, but the true heart of the cognac, a fragrance that contains within it the memory of the grapes and the chalky soil and the summer sun and the cool October morning when the fire was first lit, all of it concentrated into a single clear liquid that glows pale and bright in the candlelight. You pour the contents of the cup which holds the last portion of the heads mixed with the very first of the heart into a glass bottle that you have marked with a scratch near its neck, a bottle that will join the other faints and be added to a future batch for redistillation, because nothing is wasted in a farmhouse distillery, and even the transitional spirit has value. If not for the barrel, then for the next cycle, the next fire, the next slow morning of watching and waiting. The bottle accepts the liquid with a thin blugging sound, and you cork it firmly and set it on the shelf beside the candle, where it will wait until the day comes for its return to the pot. Now you place the glass demijohn under the spout, the vessel that will receive the heart of the spirit, the true cognac that will sleep in oak for years before it is ever tasted. The demijohn is a large container of clear glass with a narrow neck and a wide belly, its surface faintly rippled from the blowing process, and it sits on the flagstones with a solidity that matches the importance of its purpose. You adjust the wooden block beneath it so that the lip of the spout extends just inside the neck, and you step back to check the alignment, making sure that no drop will fall astray, because every drop of the heart is precious. Every drop of the heart is precious. Every drop represents the work of the vines and the pickers, and the ferment and the first fire and all the hours of this long day that is now stretching into night. The first drop of the heart falls into the demijohn with a sound that is different from the sound of the heads, a deeper note, because the vessel is larger and the air inside it resonates differently, and you watch the clear bead of spirit hit the glass bottom and spread into a tiny pool that catches the firelight and throws it back as a point of gold. A second drop follows, and a third, and the rhythm of the heart establishes itself at a pace of perhaps 5 slow breaths between each fall, a rhythm that seems to match the heartbeat of the room itself, the pulse of the fire and the copper and the night settling over the vineyard outside. The night has now fully arrived beyond the window, the last trace of grey light having faded from the sky, while you were absorbed in the transition from heads to heart. And when you glance toward the window, you see nothing but darkness pressed against the glass, a darkness so complete that the window has become a mirror reflecting the candle flame and the firebox glow and the dim shape of your own face looking back at you. You walk to the window and close the shutter gently, the wood meeting the stone sill with a soft thud that seals the room against the cold and the damp, and the distillery becomes a world unto itself, a small warm universe of copper and firelight and the slow drip of the spirit, cut off from the vineyard, and the mist and the silent rows of bare vines sleeping under the October dark. The demijohn slowly fills, the level rising so gradually that you cannot see it change from 1 minute to the next, only from 1 hour to the next when you glance at the glass and notice that the pool at the bottom has spread to cover the entire base and has begun to climb the curved sides in a pale meniscus that trembles with each new drop. The heart is running clear and pure, the fragrance in the room now fully settled into that round apricot hay almond character that you detected in its earliest form hours ago, but deeper now, richer, more certain of itself, and you breathe it in with each slow inhalation, the scent becoming as familiar as the smell of your own skin. You tend the fire with the same quiet attention you have given it all day, adding a thin split of oak when the flames begin to thin, adjusting the door gap when the draft changes, spreading the embers with the poker when they gather too thickly in one corner of the firebox, and each of these actions flows into the next without any sense of interruption. Part of the continuous movement of the evening watch. The fire is smaller than it was during the brulees, the flames lower and bluer, and this smaller fire requires less fuel but more frequent attention, a paradox that you accept without thinking about it because your hands know what to do and your mind has entered that state of calm awareness in which time passes without effort. The single tallow candle continues to burn on the shelf, its flame steady and yellow in the still air, and the wax has now melted down to a deep pool around the wick, the candle having burned for several hours since you lit it at the beginning of the evening watch. You will need to replace it before it gutters out, and you reach for a fresh candle from the small box on the shelf, a candle made from the same tallow as the first, rolled by the chandler in the village who supplies the farmhouse with candles and soap and the grease for the cart axles. And you touch the wick of the new candle to the flame of the old one, transferring the light with the same care you would use when transferring a living thing from one vessel to another. The new candle catches and the old one you pinch out between your thumb and forefinger, the thin trail of smoke rising straight up before dissipating, and you set the fresh candle in the holder and watch it settle into its own steady burn. The cooling water in the worm barrel has absorbed enough heat from the condensing vapor that you decide to add a trickle of fresh cold water to bring the temperature back down, because the bond chauffe requires the coil to be cooler than the brewless did, the slower vapor needing a sharper temperature drop to condense fully before it reaches the spout. You take a bucket of the well water that still stands near the door, its surface now at room temperature because it has been sitting in the warm distillery for hours, and you pour it into the barrel in a thin stream that enters the water with a sound like stones, under a quiet stream. A low gurgling note that is one of the oldest sounds in the world, the sound of water meeting water. The cold liquid swirls through the barrel and you can see the temperature gradient as a slight shimmer, the colder water sinking and the warmer water rising, and the copper coil pings softly as it adjusts to the new temperature. A sound that seems to come from very far away even though it is only a few feet from where you stand. You pour only a small amount, a gallon or two, because you do not want to shock the coil with too much cold at once, and when the barrel is refreshed, you set the bucket aside and wipe your hands on your apron and return to the stool, your attention settling back onto the demijohn and the slow accumulation of the heart. The drops continue their measured fall, and the level in the demijohn has now risen to perhaps the width of your hand above the bottom, a clear pale pool that seems to generate its own light, catching the fire glow and the candle flame and holding them inside itself like a liquid jewel. The night outside is now deep and silent, the kind of night that comes only in late autumn when the insects have ceased their songs and the birds have migrated, and the only sound would be the wind if there were any wind. But there is none tonight, only the stillness that has been present since dawn and is now intensified into a profound quiet that presses against the walls of the farmhouse like a held breath. You feel this quiet as a presence rather than an absence, a thing in its own right that fills the vineyard and the river valley and the dark sky above. And inside the distillery, the quiet is broken only by the fire's low murmur and the copper's occasional creak and the steady drip of the heart falling into the demijohn. And these sounds do not disturb the quiet, but rather define it, the way a few stars define the darkness of the night sky, by giving it points of reference. You have been awake now for more hours than you can easily count, having risen before dawn and worked through the morning and the afternoon and into the evening, and yet you feel no fatigue, only a deep alignment with the machine's slow metabolism, a sense that your own body has synchronized itself with the still and the fire, and is running at the same deliberate pace, your heartbeat matching the drip, and your breathing matching the draft, and your thoughts moving as slowly and clearly as the spirit itself. This is the state that distillers know but rarely speak of. A state in which the boundary between the self and the work dissolves and the hours pass without any sense of duration, the night moving forward not in minutes, but in the gradual accumulation of spirit in the demijohn, each drop marking a small unit of time that is both meaningless and profound. You check the fragrance of the heart by lifting a single drop from the spout on the tip of a clean glass rod that you keep for this purpose, a thin rod no longer than a knitting needle, and you touch the drop to your wrist where the skin is sensitive and the scent will bloom in the warmth of your body. The drop spreads into a thin film that evaporates quickly, and the fragrance that rises from your skin is the true heart of the cognac, a complex layering of pear and white flowers and almond, and something deeper that has no name, something that might be the essence of the soil itself, the chalky limestone of the châtain transmuted by the grapevine into a volatile compound that now floats above your wrist like a ghost of the vineyard. This is the spirit that will go into the barrel, the spirit that is good enough and pure enough and complete enough to begin its long sleep in the oak, and you feel a quiet satisfaction that has nothing to do with pride, only with the knowledge that the work has been done properly and the still has given you its best. The fire calls for another stick of wood, and you add it with the same unhurried motion you have used all through the night. A thin piece of oak that you place precisely on the brightest part of the ember bed, and the flames rise to meet it with a soft flare that illuminates the copper dome from below and sends a brief pulse of extra warmth through the room. You watch the flame settle into its steady burn, and then you look up at the dome above you, its surface now a deep glowing brown gold that speaks of hours of sustained warmth, the patina of a still that is working well and has been working well since the first fire of the season. The rivets along the seams are visible as small dark dots in the copper, each one a point of connection between two sheets of metal that were shaped and fitted by a craftsman who is now long dead. And you sometimes think about that craftsman when you are sitting in the quiet of the night watch, wondering what he would think if he knew that his work was still being used so many years later, still holding vapor, and still condensing spirit, and still performing the function for which it was made. The level in the demijohn continues its slow rise, the clear spirit climbing the curved glass walls in a gradual accumulation that will take most of the night to complete, and you know that you will be here for all of it, watching and waiting and adding wood to the fire and checking the cooling water and catching the occasional drop on your glass rod to be sure the heart is still running true. You brought a woolen blanket from the cupboard by the door, an old blanket with frayed edges that smells faintly of cedar from the chest where it is stored during the summer, and you drape it over your shoulders against the slight chill that has crept into the room now that the outside temperature has dropped to match the October night, and the blanket is warm and rough and comforting in the way that old textiles are comforting, carrying the memory of other cold nights and other long watches. The candle flame bends slightly in a draught that you cannot feel, a movement of air so subtle that only the flame detects it, and you watch it straighten again and continue its steady burn, the pool of liquid tallow around the wick now deep enough to reflect the flame as a small upside-down double that trembles on the surface. The demijohn catches the light from both the candle and the firebox, the two sources combining to illuminate the spirit with a warm gold color that is not really the color of the liquid but the color of the light passing through it, a borrowed beauty that will become its own beauty after years in the barrel when the spirit draws real color from the oak, a color that starts as pale straw and deepens to amber, and then to old gold, and finally to the deep mahogany of a very old cognac that has slept in wood for longer it takes to grow to dogtooth. You think about the barrels again, the way they wait in the cool, dark pantry, their staves tight and their hoops firm, each one marked with a chalk number that tells the year it was filled, and the vineyard the grapes came from, and the name of the distiller who tended the fire, which is your name, written in your own hand with a piece of chalk that leaves a white mark that can be wiped away but never is, because the marks are part of the barrel's history, and the history of the farm, and the history of the farm, and the history of the spirit itself. You will fill a new barrel with this heart when the distillation is complete, and you will write the year and the vineyard and your name on its head, and then you will roll it into the pantry to join the others, and the years will begin their slow work. The drip from the spout continues without interruption, the interval between drops, steady at 5 breaths, and the demijohn is now a third full, the spirit deep enough that the new drops make a slightly different sound when they fall, a higher note because they are falling into liquid rather than onto glass. And this change in the sound is one of the many small pleasures of the night watch, the transformation of the vessel's voice as it fills. You sit on the stool with a blanket around your shoulders and your hands folded in your lap, and the Joan and the Dame Me-Joan and the night moves around you in its vast, silent rotation, the stars crossing the sky unseen above the clouds, the river flowing dark between its banks, the vines standing motionless in their rows, and you are the only awake consciousness in all this. The tender of the fire, the watcher of the spirit, the guardian of the long, slow transferred aid that's not might to regulate at thee. The heart has run its course through the long hours of the night, and now the fragrance from the spout has begun to change again, the round apricot almond notes fading into something thinner, something that still carries a hint of spirit, but lacks the full body of the heart, and you recognize this change as the arrival of the tails, the last portion of the distillation that is too weak and too flat to include in the demijohn. You lift the glass rod and touch a drop to your wrist, holding it to the candlelight while the fragrance blooms, and the scent confirms what the slowing drip has already told you. The bon chauffe is nearing its end, the alcohol in the pot nearly exhausted, the vapor thinning with each passing minute, until soon there will be nothing left worth collecting. You rise from the stool, the woolen blanket slipping from your shoulders onto the seat behind you, and you cross to the spout with the careful steps of someone who's been sitting for many hours and whose legs need a moment to remember their purpose. The demijohn is now more than half full, its contents blowing with that pale borrowed gold that will deepen over the years into true amber, and you place your hands on its cool glass sides, feeling the weight of the spirit and the faint vibration of the still traveling up through the flagstones and into the vessel. This demijohn holds the heart of the cognac, the pure center of the distillation that has been hours in the making, the essence that will go into the barrel and begin its long sleep, and you feel a quiet sense of completion as you stand over it in the candlelight, a sense that the work has been done properly and the still has given you what you asked of it. You lift the demijohn carefully from its wooden block, using both hands and bending your knees rather than your back, the weight of the spirit and the glass together requiring a respect that you have learned over many seasons, and you carry it across the flagstones to the oak table where the ceramic jug of brewlis stood earlier in the day. The demijohn settles onto the wood with a soft clink, and you turn it slightly so that the chalk mark you will write on its side will face outward, visible from the door, though you have not yet written the mark and will not until the spirit has rested and you have made your final judgment of its quality, a judgment that will come after you have slept and the day has returned and you can taste a single drop diluted with clean water and rolled across your tongue in the morning light. You return to the spout and replace the demijohn with the same glass cup you used for the heads, because the tails that are now falling are still worth collecting, containing as they do a small amount of alcohol that can be recovered in the next distillation cycle, added to the next batch of wine, along with the heads and the lees and all the other fractions that are not quite pure enough for the barrel, but still hold a memory of the spirit within them. The tails fall into the cup with a sound that is higher and lighter than the sound of the heart, the drops smaller and less viscous, and the smell that rises from them is faintly musty, a hint of wet grain and old wood, not unpleasant, but not beautiful either. A functional smell that speaks of completion rather than promise. The fire in the firebox has burned low during the final stages of the heart, and you kneel before it one last time, opening the door fully to look at the bed of embers that has been your companion through the day and the night. The embers are deep and red, the oak sticks you added through the evening having reduced themselves to a glowing mass that pulses gently in the draught, a mass that still holds enough heat to finish the tails and could, if you let it, burn through the rest of the night and into the next morning. But the work is done, and the still needs to rest, as you need to rest, and so you take the poker and begin the slow, careful work of banking the fire, the final task of the distiller before the doors are closed and the quiet is allowed to reclaim the room. Banking a fire is an old skill, older than distillation, older than the copper still, a skill that goes back to the first humans who learned to keep embers alive through the night by covering them with ash, so that the morning would not require the cold work of striking flint on stone. You push the embers gently toward the back of the firebox, using the flat of the poker to slide them across the firebrick floor in a slow orange drift, and you gather them into a mound about the size of a loaf of bread. A mound that glows brighter as you compress it because the embers touch one another more closely and share their heat. When the mound is formed, you reach for the small iron shovel that hangs beside the broom, and you scoop a measure of fine grey ash from the bucket where it has been waiting since you cleaned a firebox at dawn, a whole day ago, a whole lifetime ago, and you sprinkle the ash over the mound of embers in a thick, even layer that covers the orange glow completely, turning the mound from a bright jewel into a soft grey hillock that looks cold, but is not. The ash will hold the heat through the night, insulating the embers from the air so that they burn more slowly than slowly, consuming themselves at a rate that will leave a living spark at the center of the mound when you return in the morning, a spark that can be woken with a breath and a handful of twigs, and will begin the whole cycle again. You pat the ash down gently with the back of the shovel, smoothing it like a gardener smoothing soil over a newly planted seed. And then you close the firebox door and latch it, and feel the immediate change in the room as the main source of light is sealed away, leaving only the candle on the shelf to push back the darkness that has been waiting in the corners all night. The tales continue to drip into the glass cup, the intervals now stretch to 10 or 12 breaths between each drop, and you know that the run is very near its absolute end, the pot nearly empty of anything worth condensing. You wait for 3 more drops, counting them with the patience of someone who has been counting drops since the middle of the previous morning, and when the 4th drop takes so long to form that you begin to wonder if it will come at all, you reach under the spout and lift the cup away, and the run is finished. The last drop that gathered on the copper lip falls onto the flagstones with a tiny sound that disappears into the silence, and the still is quiet for the first time since the fire was lit. The steady voice of the spirit replaced by nothing but the faint tick of the cooling copper and a distant murmur of the candle flame. You pour the tales from the glass cup into the bottle marked for the faints, joining the last of the spirit with the heads and the other cast-offs that will return to the pot in the next cycle, and you cork the bottle firmly and set it on the shelf beside the candle, the glass cool and dark against the warm glow of the room. The shelf now holds all the vessels of the day's work arranged in a neat row, the bottle of heads, the bottle of tails, the ceramic jug of brewis that you will use to top up the next charge, and the empty glass cup that you will wash and return to its hook, and each of these vessels has its own purpose and its own place in the long cycle of the distilling season. A cycle that will continue until the last of the wine has been run, and the last of the spirit has been barreled, and the fire is banked for the final time before the spring. You take a clean linen rag from the shelf and wipe the spout carefully, removing the last traces of spirit from the copper lip so that no drop will drip onto the flagstones during the night and attract dust or insects, and the rag comes away smelling faintly of the heart, that apricot almond fragrance that has filled the room for so many hours. And you fold the rag and set it aside for washing, and then you stand quite still in the center of the room, your hands resting at your sides, and you listen to the silence that has replaced the sound of the still play. The silence is not complete because the cooling copper still ticks softly as it contracts from its working temperature, and the candle still hisses almost imperceptibly as the tallow burns, and somewhere outside the walls a small creature, a mouse or a shrew, moves through the dry leaves at the edge of the yard with a rustle that is barely audible but still present if you listen for it. But underneath these small sounds, the silence is deep and vast and carries within it the memory of the day that has passed. The slow fire and the grey mist and the drip of the brewis and the vigil of the heart, and you stand in this silence and let it wash over you with the same acceptance you have given to every moment of the long watch. The demijohn of heart spirit sits on the oak table, its glass sides cool now to the touch, and you place your palm against the rounded belly of the vessel, and feel the slight chill of the spirit inside, the warmth of the distillation having dissipated into the room over the hours since the cut was made. In the morning you will taste a single drop, diluted with clean water, and you will make the final judgment of quality that will determine which barrel receives this heart and how long it must sleep before it is ready. But that is the task of the morning, and the morning is still several hours away. the darkness outside the shuttered window still complete and the stars still crossing the invisible sky above the clouds. For now, the spirit needs nothing from you except to be left alone in the quiet dark, to settle and to rest. And you are ready to give it that rest, because you need rest yourself, a deep and dreamless sleep that will restore the attention and the patience you have spent through the long hours of the day and the night. You walk to the window and check that the shutter is firmly closed, pressing your hand against the wood to feel that it is seated properly against the stone sill. And then you turn back toward the room and begin the small final tasks of closing the distillery for the night. You lift the water bucket from beside the worm barrel and set it near the door where you will carry it outside in the morning. The water still cool, but no longer cold, and you hang the poker on its hook and the shovel beside it, and the broom on its nail, each tool returning to its proper place with the ease of long habit. You collect the scrap of linen that held your bread and cheese, folding it and placing it on the shelf for tomorrow, and you pour the last of the water from your cup into the clay pitcher so that the cup will be dry and clean when you return. Every surface is tidied, every tool is stored, every vessel is sealed, and the room settles into a state of order that matches the order of the vineyard outside. The rows of vines and the stacked baskets and the swept yard, all of it ready for the next day, and the swept yard, all of it ready for the next day, and the next work, and the next fire. You lift the woolen blanket from the stool and fold it loosely, draping it over the back of the stool so that it will be waiting for you when you return in the morning. And then you walk to the shelf where the candle burns, and you stand before it for a moment, looking at the small flame that has been your companion through the evening and the night. The flame is shorter now than it was when you lit it, the tallow having burned down to the last half-inch of the candle's life, and the pool of liquid wax around the wick is deep and clear and trembles slightly with the movement of the air. You lean down and blow across the flame with a single soft breath, and the flame bends and flickers and goes out, leaving behind a thin trail of smoke that rises straight up in the still air and then curves and dissipates, and the room is dark except for the faintest glow from the banked fire that seeps through the cracks around the firebox door. The darkness in the distillery is not frightening or sad, but comfortable, the darkness of a room that has served its purpose and now rests, and you stand in it for a moment letting your eyes adjust, the shapes of the alembic and the table and the barrels emerging slowly from the blackness as faint silhouettes against the deeper black of the walls. The copper dome catches some small reflection from a source you cannot identify, perhaps a sliver of starlight that has found a gap in the shutter, and it glows with a dim brown light that seems to come from inside the metal itself, a memory of the fire that has been absorbed into the copper and will radiate slowly through the night until the morning comes and the fire is rekindled. You walk to the door, your shoes making the same soft sound on the flagstones that they have made all day, and you pause with your hand on the iron latch and look back into the dark room one last time, though you can see almost nothing. Only the darker shape of the alembic against the dark wall, and the faint rectangle of the shuttered window, and the soft orange seam around the firebox door, where the banked embers still pulse with their hidden heat. The smell of the distillery is still present, the oak and the copper and the last traces of the apricot almond heart, and you breathe it in deeply, holding it in your lungs as though you could store it there and carry it with you into your sleep. Then you lift the latch and open the door and step out of the distillery into the cold hallway of the farmhouse, and you close the heavy wooden door behind you with a gentle pull that seats it firmly in its frame. The hallway is dark and cool, the stone walls holding the temperature of the October night, and you walk slowly toward the stair that leads to your sleeping room above, your hand brushing the wall for guidance in the dark, the stones rough and familiar under your palm. The farmhouse is silent around you, the kitchen half cold and the pantry door closed, and the roof beams settled into their centuries-old positions, and the silence is of a different quality than the silence in the distillery, deeper and more private, the silence of a house that holds no fire and no watch and no waiting spirit, only the slow breathing of old wood and old stone and the person who has tended them both. You climb the stair with heavy feet, the wooden steps creaking in their familiar pattern, the fifth step from the bottom always groaning louder than the others as it has done since you were a child. And your father's father climbed these same stairs, and the sound is not a disturbance but a comfort, a voice that says you are home and the day is done and the work is good. At the top of the stair, your sleeping room waits with its small window that looks out over the vineyard, and you cross to the window and look out one last time before you sleep, pushing open the shutter just enough to see the dark rows of vines stretching toward the invisible river and the darker line of the poplars against the dark sky, and the faintest suggestion of mist rising from the hollow, a pale grey ghost in a world of black and charcoal. The stars are out above the vineyard, the clouds having thinned sometime during the night while you were watching the heart fall into the demijohn. And they are the first stars you have seen all day, the first break in the grey overcast that has covered the sky since dawn, and they shine with the cold, clear light of late October, a light that has travelled for years and years across the darkness to reach this small window and this tired watcher and this sleeping landscape. You watch the stars for a span of time that has no measure, your breathing slow and your thoughts still, and then you close the shutter and turn to your bed and lie down under the woolen blankets that smell of cedar and lavender and the faint smoke from the distillery fire, and you close your eyes and let the long day settle over you like the ash settling over the embers in the firebox, preserving the warmth and the light for the morning that will come in its own time, patient and grey and full of the quiet work that waits for no end. The clock won't be